been sitting here for about an hour now, trying to figure out how to start this. My name is Officer Mike Brennan, badge number 2847, Millbrook Police Department. I've been wearing this uniform for 15 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. Domestic disputes that turn bloody, drug busts gone wrong, car accidents that paint the asphalt red. You name it, I've probably cleaned it up or filled out the paperwork for it. But what happened in our little town between March and April of 2019, that's something different entirely. That's something that still makes me check my locks twice before I go to bed. Something that's got me sitting here at 2 a.m. talking into this recorder because I can't sleep. I guess I should start by telling you about Millbrook. It's one of those places that looks like it was pulled straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody else's business. Population hovers around 8,000. Most of them good people just trying to make a living and raise their kids. We've got a main street with a hardware store that's been run by the same family for 3 generations, a diner where the coffee's always hot and the pie's always fresh, and a town square with a gazebo where they hold the summer concerts. It's the kind of place where the biggest crime is usually teenagers toilet papering the high school, or someone's dog getting into their neighbor's garbage. That's what made what happened so much worse, I think. When evil comes to a place like Millbrook, it stands out like blood on fresh snow. People notice, people talk, and when people start dying, well, that's when folks start looking over their shoulders and wondering who they can really trust. I was working the night shift back then, had been for about 3 years. Midnight to 8 a.m., patrolling the quiet streets while most of the town slept. I actually liked those hours. There's something peaceful about driving through empty neighborhoods, watching over people while they dream. Most nights, the biggest excitement was breaking up a party that got too loud or helping someone who locked themselves out of their car. I'd cruise down Elm Street, past the old Victorian houses with their wraparound porches, down to the lake where the fog would roll in thick some nights, making everything look like a ghost town. The weather that March was typical for upstate New York. Cold, damp, with these bone-chilling nights that made you want to stay inside with a warm cup of something and a good book. I'd been on duty for about 3 hours when the call came in on March 15th. It was 2:43 a.m., and I was parked outside the 24-hour gas station on Route 9, filling out some paperwork from an earlier fender bender, when dispatch crackled over the radio. Unit 47, we've got a welfare check on Birch Lane. Elderly female caller reports hearing someone outside her residence. I keyed the mic. Copy that. Dispatch. What's the address? 847 Birch Lane. Caller is Dorothy Kellerman, age 74. She's reporting noises outside her bedroom window and someone calling her name. I'd been to 847 Birch Lane before. A small ranch house with white aluminum siding and a front porch that had seen better days. Mrs. Kellerman lived alone there, had ever since her husband passed away from a heart attack about 2 years prior. She was one of those sweet old ladies who'd wave from her window when I drove by on patrol. The kind who probably kept homemade cookies in her kitchen and had photos of grandchildren covering her refrigerator. As I drove down Birch Lane, I noticed how thick the fog was getting. It was rolling in from the lake, turning the streetlights into these ghostly halos that barely penetrated the darkness. The whole neighborhood felt wrapped in cotton, muffled and strange. I could barely make out the houses as I passed them, just dim shapes looming out of the mist. It was the kind of night that made you think about ghost stories and things that go bump in the night. I pulled up to Mrs. Kellerman's house and sat in my patrol car for a minute, scanning the area. The fog was so thick I could barely see her front porch, let alone any signs of an intruder. I grabbed my flashlight and got out, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. My breath came out in white puffs as I walked up the cracked concrete path to her front door. Before I could even knock, the door opened just a crack. I could see the security chain stretched tight across the gap, and Mrs. Kellerman's worried face peering out at me. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice shaky and thin. "I'm Dorothy Kellerman. I called about the noise. Ma'am, I'm Officer Brennan. Can you tell me what you heard?" She undid the chain with trembling fingers and opened the door wider. Dorothy Kellerman was exactly what I expected. A small, frail woman in her 70s, wearing a faded pink bathrobe over her nightgown. Her gray hair was pulled back in a bun, and her eyes were wide with fear behind thick glasses. She kept glancing over my shoulder into the fog-shrouded yard, as if she expected something to come lunging out of the darkness. "He was calling my name," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. Standing right out there by my bedroom window, just calling for Dorothy, over and over. I felt that familiar tingle you get when something doesn't add up right. "Ma'am, are you sure it was your name? Could have been someone calling for their dog, or maybe..." "No." She shook her head firmly, her voice gaining strength. "It was my name, Dorothy, clear as day, and then..." She paused, swallowing hard. "Then he tried the back door." That got my attention. A prowler testing door handles was a whole different animal from someone just making noise in the yard. I asked her to stay inside and keep the door locked while I checked the perimeter of her property. Walking around that house in the fog was like moving through a bad dream. My flashlight beam only penetrated about 6 feet before the mist swallowed it up, creating this cone of yellow light that made everything beyond it seem even darker. I could hear my own footsteps on the wet grass, the creak of tree branches in the slight breeze, the distant hum of a car engine somewhere out on the main road. But everything else was silent, that deep, heavy silence that only comes in the small hours of the night when the world feels like it's holding its breath. I found the footprints under her bedroom window, pressed into the muddy flower bed that ran along the side of the house. They were clear enough to see that someone had definitely been there, standing close to the window. But the fog and dampness had softened them so much that I couldn't make out any details about shoe size or tread pattern. I followed them around to the back of the house, where they led right up to the back door. The door itself showed no signs of the forced entry, but when I tested the handle, it turned easily. "Mrs. Kellerman," I called out as I came back around to the front. "Your back door is unlocked." Her face went white. I always lock it. I check it every night before I go to bed." I helped her lock the back door and did a quick check of the interior to make sure no one had gotten inside. The house smelled like lavender and old coffee, with that particular scent that seems to cling to places where elderly people live. Not unpleasant, just lived in. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, and I could see a half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table next to a cup of tea that had gone cold. Probably just some teenager playing pranks, I told her as I prepared to leave, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. Who targets a 74-year-old woman living alone for a prank? And how would they know her name? Most importantly, why would they try to enter her house? I filed the report back at the station, noting the footprints and the unlocked door. I recommended increased patrols for Birch Lane and made a mental note to drive by Mrs. Kellerman's house more frequently during my shifts. But as I continued my patrol that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, that there was a piece of this puzzle I wasn't seeing. The fog didn't lift until almost dawn, and by the time my shift ended, the whole incident felt like something that had happened in a different world. In the harsh light of morning, with people heading to work and kids waiting for school buses, it was easy to dismiss what had happened as just another routine call. An old woman living alone, maybe a little confused, maybe a little paranoid. It happens more often than you'd think. But that feeling of wrongness, that stayed with me. And 4 days later, when dispatch sent me to another house on the other side of town for an almost identical call, I knew my instincts had been right. The second call came in on March 19th, just after 3 a.m. I was parked on Oak Street, keeping an eye on the Miller house where we'd had reports of domestic disturbances in the past, when the radio crackled to life. Unit 47, we've got another welfare check. 1247 Maple Street. Elderly male caller reports suspicious activity outside his residence. As I drove toward Maple Street, I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. Another elderly resident, another middle-of-the-night call about someone outside their house. The fog wasn't as thick that night, but there was still a damp chill in the air that seemed to seep through your clothes and settle in your bones. 1247 Maple Street was a small Cape Cod-style house with blue shutters and a white picket fence that had seen better days. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow over the front steps, and I could see movement behind the curtains in the front window. As I walked up the path, the front door opened before I could knock. "Officer, thank you for coming," said the man, standing in the doorway. He was tall and thin, probably in his late 70s, with white hair that stuck up in all directions like he'd been running his hands through it. He wore a brown cardigan over pajamas and fuzzy slippers. "I'm Harold Chen. I called about someone being outside my house." Harold Chen. I knew that name from somewhere, but I couldn't place it right away. "Mr. Chen, can you tell me what happened?" He stepped aside to let me in, and I immediately noticed how neat and organized everything was. Books lined the walls in precise rows, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. The kind of home that belonged to someone who'd had a lot of time to organize their life down to the smallest detail. "I was in bed, reading," he said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "It was about 2:30, maybe 2:45. I heard someone outside my bedroom window calling my name. Not yelling, you understand, just calling. Harold, Harold, like they knew me. The same pattern, the same exact pattern as Mrs. Kellerman's call. Did you see anyone, Mr. Chen?" I looked out the window, but it was too dark, but I heard footsteps, moving around the side of the house, and then he paused, wrapping his arms around himself. Then I heard someone try the back door, the handle rattling. I spent the next half hour going over his property with a fine-tooth comb. Found the same thing I'd found at Mrs. Kellerman's house. Footprints under the bedroom window leading around to the back door. And just like before, the back door was unlocked, even though Mr. Chen swore he'd locked it before going to bed. "This is the second call like this I've had this week," I told him, as I helped him secure the back door. "Have you been in the hospital recently, Mr. Chen?" He looked surprised by the question. "Yes, actually. I had a mild heart attack about 3 months ago. Spent 4 days at Millbrook General. Why do you ask?" That's when it clicked. Mrs. Kellerman had mentioned during our conversation that she'd been in the hospital recently for some tests. Both victims had been patients at Millbrook General Hospital. "Just trying to establish if there's any connection," I said, not wanting to alarm him unnecessarily. "I'm going to recommend increased patrols in this area, and I'd suggest you double-check all your locks before going to bed." After I left Mr. Chen's house, I sat in my patrol car for a long time, thinking. 2 elderly residents living alone, both recent hospital patients, both experiencing the same type of incident. Someone calling their name outside their bedroom window, trying to get into their house through the back door. It wasn't random. It couldn't be random. I drove back to the station and pulled up the incident report from Mrs. Kellerman's call. In my notes, I'd written down that she'd mentioned being in the hospital for some tests about 2 months ago. Millbrook General, same as Mr. Chen. I started to reach for the phone to call the hospital, then stopped. It was 4 a.m. No one would be available to talk to me about patient records anyway, and I wasn't even sure what I was looking for yet. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but I couldn't get those 2 calls out of my head. I drove past both houses several times, checking for any signs of trouble, but everything remained quiet. As the sun came up and the day shift took over, I found myself wondering if I was seeing patterns where none existed. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe Millbrook was just having a rash of prowler incidents. But then came the 3rd call, March 23rd, 2:17 a.m., Elm Drive this time. Mrs. Agnes Patterson, 82 years old, living alone in a 2-story colonial that had probably been beautiful once, but now looked tired and weathered. Same story, someone calling her name outside her bedroom window, trying the back door. Same footprints in the mud, same unlocked door that she swore she'd locked before bed. I was so scared, she told me, her hand shaking as she held a cup of tea. The voice was so gentle, so familiar. For a moment I almost thought. She trailed off, staring into her tea. Thought what, Mrs. Patterson? Well, it sounds silly now, but I almost thought it was my nurse from the hospital, from when I was there last month. He had such a kind voice, always checking on me during the night shift. Made me feel safe, you know? Like someone was watching out for me. The night shift. My pulse quickened. Can you remember his name? She thought for a moment. Thomas, I think. Yes, Thomas something. He was so sweet, always asking about my family and making sure I was comfortable. He even remembered little things about me when he came back the next night. 3 calls. 3 elderly residents living alone. 3 recent patients at Millbrook General Hospital. And now a possible connection to a specific night shift nurse named Thomas. I finished up with Mrs. Patterson and drove straight to Millbrook General. The hospital was quiet at that hour, just the emergency department still bustling with activity. I found the security desk and asked to speak with someone about their night shift nursing staff. "I'm sorry, officer," the security guard said, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "You'd need to talk to administration about personnel information, and they won't be in until 8 a.m. "This is police business," I said, showing him my badge. "I need to speak with someone now about one of your night nurses. Thomas something." The guard looked nervous. I don't know if I'm supposed to. "Look, I'm investigating a series of incidents involving elderly patients who were discharged from this hospital. I just need to verify some information." He thought about it for a moment, then picked up the phone. "Let me call the nursing supervisor." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a small office on the 3rd floor, talking to Helen Martinez, the night nursing supervisor. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd clearly seen everything the job could throw at her. "You're asking about Thomas Carver," she said after I'd explained the situation. "He's been working here for about 8 months. Cardiac unit, night shift. Is he in some kind of trouble? I'm not sure yet. Can you tell me anything about his patient interactions? Any complaints or concerns?" Helen frowned. "No complaints. Actually, the opposite. Patients love him. He's very attentive, very caring, goes out of his way to make them comfortable. Some of the other nurses have mentioned that he seems to form unusually strong bonds with his patients, especially the elderly ones." "What do you mean by unusually strong bonds?" "Well, he remembers details about their lives, their families. He'll ask about their grandchildren by name, remember their favorite foods, that sort of thing. It's actually quite sweet, though some of the staff think it's a bit much." I asked for a list of patients who had been discharged from the cardiac unit in the past 3 months. Helen hesitated. citing privacy concerns, but I explained that this was part of an ongoing investigation and that I could get a warrant if necessary. She agreed to provide the information, but it would take some time to compile. By the time I left the hospital, the sun was coming up, and I was officially off duty, but I couldn't go home. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I drove to the diner on Main Street and sat in a corner booth, drinking coffee and thinking about what I'd learned. 3 elderly patients, all from the cardiac unit, all visited by someone who knew their names and seemed to know they lived alone. Someone who was trying to get into their houses in the middle of the night. Someone who might be connected to a nurse named Thomas Carver. I was still sitting there when my phone rang. It was dispatch. "Mike, I know you're off duty, but we've got another one. 423 Oak Avenue. Elderly female caller. Same type of incident as those other calls you've been handling. Day shift is tied up with a 3-car accident on Route 9. Can you take it?" I was already reaching for my keys. On my way. The 4th call was different. When I arrived at 423 Oak Avenue, I found 79-year-old Margaret Foster sitting on her front porch steps, still in her nightgown and robe, crying. "He knew about my medication," she sobbed as I helped her back inside. "He called my name, and when I looked out the window, he said he was there to help me with my heart pills. He knew I had trouble remembering to take them." Margaret Foster's house was different from the others. Where Mrs. Kellerman and Mr. Chen had neat, organized homes, Margaret's place showed signs of someone struggling to maintain their independence. Pills scattered across the kitchen counter, unopened mail stacked in precarious piles, dishes in the sink that had been there for days. The smell of old coffee and something vaguely medicinal hung in the air. "Tell me exactly what happened, Mrs. Foster," I said, helping her settle into a worn armchair in her living room. The cushions were faded and sagged in the middle, and there were at least 6 different prescription bottles on the side table next to her chair. "I woke up around 2:30, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I heard my name being called, very softly. Margaret, Margaret, just like that. So I got up and looked out my bedroom window, and there was someone standing there in the yard. Could you see who it was? Not clearly. It was dark, and my eyesight isn't what it used to be. But then he spoke again, and he said..." She paused, her voice breaking. "He said he was there to help me with my heart medication. He knew I had trouble remembering to take it properly." The detail hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just someone who knew her name. This was someone who knew intimate details about her medical condition and daily struggles. "Mrs. Foster, have you been a patient at Millbrook General recently?" "Yes, about 6 weeks ago. I had chest pains and they kept me for 3 days. The nurses were so kind, especially the night nurse. He was so concerned about my medication schedule. Kept asking questions about how I managed at home." "Do you remember his name?" "Thomas. Thomas something. He was so thoughtful, always checking on me, making sure I understood my discharge instructions. He even wrote down a schedule for my medications and said he worried about patients like me who lived alone." I felt the pieces clicking into place, but the picture they were forming was more disturbing than I'd imagined. "Mrs. Foster, did you hear anyone try your doors last night?" "Yes, the back door. I heard the handle turning. That's when I called 911. I went through the same routine, checking the perimeter, finding the footprints, discovering that the back door was unlocked despite her insistence that she'd locked it before bed. But this time, I noticed something else. The footprints were deeper near the back door, as if someone had stood there for a long time, maybe trying different keys or tools. When I got back to the station, I called Helen Martinez at the hospital. It was 7 a.m., still early, but I knew she'd be there. "I need to talk to Thomas Carver," I said without preamble. "When does he come in for his shift?" "He's actually not scheduled tonight," Helen said. "He called in sick. Said he was coming down with something. Is everything okay? I need his address and phone number. This is urgent." "Officer Brennan, I can't just give out employee information without—" "Helen, I have 4 elderly patients who've been terrorized in their homes. All of them were recent patients in your cardiac unit. All of them have mentioned a night nurse named Thomas. I need to speak with him now." There was a long pause. "I'll call the personnel department." 20 minutes later, I was driving to 1847 Riverside Drive, a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Thomas Carver lived in Unit 12B, a second-floor apartment with a view of the parking lot. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the building, trying to decide on my approach. I had suspicions, but no concrete evidence. No witnesses who could identify him, no physical evidence linking him to the incidents. I was about to get out of my car when I saw him. A thin man in his 30s, wearing scrubs and a light jacket, walking across the parking lot toward a beat-up Honda Civic. Even from a distance, I could see the hospital ID badge clipped to his shirt pocket. Thomas Carver. It had to be him. I followed him at a distance as he drove through town. He stopped at a gas station, bought coffee and a newspaper, then drove to a residential area I didn't recognize. He parked on Sycamore Street and got out, walking purposefully toward a small house with a well-maintained garden. I parked around the corner and followed on foot, staying far enough back to avoid detection. The house he approached was 634 Sycamore Street, a neat little bungalow with white trim and flower boxes under the windows. I watched as he walked slowly around the perimeter of the house, stopping at each window, peering inside. My blood ran cold. He was casing the place. I called for backup and crept closer, staying behind a neighbor's hedge. Carver was at the back of the house now, trying the back door handle, just like the others. When he found it locked, he pulled something from his pocket. It looked like a small tool, maybe a lockpick or a thin knife. "Police! Stop right there!" He spun around, eyes wide with surprise and fear. In the daylight, I could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s with pale skin and light brown hair. But it was his eyes that struck me. They had an intensity that was unsettling, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. "Officer, I was just—" He stammered, still holding the tool in his hand. "Drop whatever you're holding and put your hands behind your head." He complied, but I could see his mind racing, trying to come up with an explanation. "I was just checking on Mrs. Henderson. She's elderly, lives alone. I was worried about her." "Mrs. Henderson, you know, the resident of this house. She was my patient at the hospital. I wanted to make sure she was okay. By breaking into her house? No, you don't understand. I was trying to help. These elderly people, they're so vulnerable. They need someone to watch out for them." Backup arrived just as I was putting handcuffs on him. Officers Rodriguez and Patterson took him into custody while I went to the front door of 634 Sycamore Street to check on the resident. Mrs. Henderson was indeed an elderly woman, probably in her 80s, who confirmed that she'd been a patient at Millbrook General about a month ago. She'd been discharged from the cardiac unit after treatment for irregular heartbeat. She didn't know why someone would be trying to break into her house, but she was grateful that I'd been there to stop it. Back at the station, I sat across from Thomas Carver in interview room 2. He'd waived his right to an attorney, saying he wanted to explain everything, to make me understand. The recording equipment was running, and Detective Sarah Walsh was sitting beside me, taking notes. "Thomas, let's start with Mrs. Kellerman. Dorothy Kellerman, 847 Birch Lane. You know her, don't you?" "Yes, she was my patient. Sweet old lady, lives alone, has trouble managing her medications." And you visited her house on March 15th around 2:30 a.m.? I was checking on her, making sure she was okay. By standing outside her bedroom window and calling her name, he looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why that would be a problem. I wanted to make sure she was awake, that she was alert. Sometimes elderly patients become confused at night. And you tried to enter her house through the back door? I had a key. The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Detective Walsh and I exchanged glances. You had a key to Mrs. Kellerman's house. I made one. During her stay at the hospital, she was so worried about managing on her own. She gave me her spare key so I could check on her after she went home. Thomas, that's not standard procedure for hospital staff. I know, but I care about my patients, more than the hospital does. They discharge these people and just forget about them. But I don't forget. For the next 2 hours, Thomas Carver told us a story that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. He'd been checking on discharged patients for months, convincing them to give him spare keys or making copies when they weren't looking. He'd memorized their addresses from their charts, learned their routines, their medications, their family situations. I would visit them after their discharge, he explained, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. I'd call their names first to make sure they were okay. If they didn't answer, I'd let myself in to check on them. Sometimes they'd fallen, sometimes they'd forgotten to take their medication. Sometimes they just needed someone to talk to. And if they died while you were checking on them, then I'd help them have a peaceful transition. I'd make sure they weren't in pain. The room went dead silent. Detective Walsh had stopped taking notes and was staring at him with undisguised horror. Thomas, are you saying you killed patients? I helped them. They were suffering, alone, forgotten. I made sure their last moments were peaceful. That's when we knew we weren't dealing with a simple stalker or would-be burglar. We were dealing with something much worse. The confession that followed was like something out of a nightmare. Thomas Carver sat in that interview room for 6 hours, calmly describing what he called his mercy visits to discharged patients. Detective Walsh had to step out twice, once to be sick, and once because she said she couldn't listen to any more without losing her mind. The first time was an accident, he said, his voice eerily calm. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, 83 years old. She'd been discharged from cardiac after a mild heart attack. I went to check on her about a week later, around 3 a.m. I used the spare key she'd given me. She was so grateful for my attention at the hospital, she wanted me to be able to check on her. What happened when you got inside? She was having chest pains, severe ones. She was crying, begging me to help her. The ambulance would have taken too long, and she was in so much agony. So I helped her. How? Morphine. I carried a small amount with me, just in case of emergencies. I gave her enough to stop the pain. She went peacefully, holding my hand. She thanked me. Detective Walsh came back into the room just as he was describing Mrs. Vasquez's death. Her face was pale, but she managed to keep her composure as she sat back down. Thomas, how many patients did you help this way? He thought for a moment, as if he was trying to remember what he'd had for lunch. 11. No, 12. Mrs. Vasquez was the first, but then I realized that I had a calling. These people were suffering, and their families had abandoned them. Someone needed to care. Tell us about the others. For the next 3 hours, he methodically described each death. Mr. Frank Morrison, 76, found dead in his recliner after complaining of difficulty breathing during one of Thomas's visits. Mrs. Ruth Campbell, 82, who died in her sleep after Thomas helped her with what he called medication management. Mr. James Fletcher, 79, who passed away peacefully in his bed after Thomas determined he was ready for transition. Each story was the same. Thomas would visit his former patients weeks after their discharge, always in the early morning hours. He'd call their names outside their windows first to see if they were awake and alert. If they didn't respond, or if they seemed confused or distressed when they did respond, he'd let himself in using keys he'd obtained through various means. I never forced my way in, he insisted, as if that made it better. They all trusted me. They remembered me from the hospital. I was the nurse who cared about them, who listened to their stories, who made them feel important. And once you were inside, I'd assess their condition, their mental state, their physical comfort, their medication compliance. If they were struggling, if they were in pain, if they seemed confused or frightened, I'd help them find peace. With morphine, usually, sometimes other medications depending on their condition. I always made sure it was painless. The most chilling part was how he described his decision-making process. He had detailed notes on each patient, their living situations, their family contact frequency, their medical conditions, their daily routines. He'd compiled this information during their hospital stays, asking seemingly innocent questions about their home lives and memorizing the answers. I could tell which ones would struggle, he said, the ones whose families never visited or visited out of obligation, the ones who were afraid to go home because they knew they couldn't manage on their own, the ones who cried when I was nice to them because they weren't used to kindness. Thomas, these people called 911 because they were scared. Mrs. Kellerman, Mr. Chen, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Foster, they were terrified when you showed up at their houses. They were confused. It's common in elderly patients, especially at night. I wasn't there to hurt them. I was there to assess whether they needed help. Help dying, you mean? Help finding peace. Help ending their suffering. Detective Walsh leaned forward. What about the patients who didn't seem to be suffering? The ones who were managing fine on their own? Thomas looked genuinely puzzled by the question. But they were all suffering. Maybe not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. They were alone, forgotten, just waiting to die. I was offering them dignity. By murdering them. By caring for them. By being there in their final moments so they didn't have to die alone. The psychological evaluation later would describe Thomas Carver as a textbook case of what they called Angel of Mercy syndrome. Healthcare workers who kill patients under the delusion that they're providing compassionate care. But sitting in that room, listening to him describe 12 murders with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather, all I could think about was how close he'd come to killing 4 more people. The recent visits, I said. Mrs. Kellerman, Mr. Chen, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Foster. What was different about them? They weren't ready yet. Mrs. Kellerman was still alert, still fighting. Mr. Chen had family who called regularly. Mrs. Patterson had a neighbor who checked on her. Mrs. Foster, ... He paused. Mrs. Foster was struggling with her medications, but she was still hopeful. Still talking about her grandson's upcoming wedding. So, you decided not to help them? I decided to wait, to continue monitoring them. Sometimes, patients need more time to reach the point where mercy is appropriate. The room went silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet whir of the recording equipment. I looked at Detective Walsh, and I could see my own thoughts reflected in her eyes. How many more would there have been? How many elderly patients was he planning to monitor until he decided they were ready to die? We charged him with 12 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of attempted breaking and entering. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of death that stretched back almost 2 years. Hospital records showed that Thomas had been systematically targeting vulnerable patients, charming them during their stays, gathering information about their home situations, and then following up with deadly house calls. The most disturbing discovery came when we searched his apartment. In a filing cabinet in his bedroom, we found detailed files on 47 different patients. Each file contained photos he'd taken secretly during their hospital stays, copies of their medical records, hand-drawn maps of their neighborhoods, and notes about their daily routines and family contact patterns. But it was the notebook we found hidden under his mattress that really showed us the scope of what we were dealing with. In neat, precise handwriting, Thomas had created what he called his mercy schedule. It listed patients by priority level, with detailed explanations of why each one qualified for his intervention. Priority 1 patients were those he deemed immediately ready for transition, the elderly with no family contact, severe depression, or multiple medical complications. Priority 2 were patients who might need intervention within 6 months. Priority 3 were those he was still monitoring. Mrs. Kellerman, Mr. Chen, Mrs. Patterson, and Mrs. Foster were all listed as Priority 2. There were 23 names on that list we hadn't contacted yet. We spent the next 3 days reaching out to every name in Thomas's files. Most of them were still alive, but 5 had died since their discharge from Millbrook General. Natural causes, according to their death certificates. Found peacefully in their beds or chairs, no signs of trauma, no indication of foul play. "I want those bodies exhumed," Detective Walsh said after we'd finished going through the files. Every single one of them. The exhumations revealed traces of morphine in 2 of the 5 bodies. Levels consistent with deliberate overdose, not prescribed medication. 2 more murders we could prove, bringing the total to 14. But I knew there were more. Thomas had worked at 3 other hospitals before coming to Millbrook. We contacted police departments in those jurisdictions and found similar patterns of elderly patients dying peacefully at home weeks after discharge. The investigation was ongoing when Thomas finally went to trial. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming he genuinely believed he was providing compassionate care. His defense attorney painted him as a mentally ill man who'd been driven to his actions by a misguided desire to help people. The prosecution called him a calculated killer who'd used his position of trust to prey on the most vulnerable members of society. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. But the trial was just the beginning of the nightmare for me. Because during his testimony, Thomas Carver said something that's haunted me every day since. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I had to testify twice. Once during the prosecution's case, describing the investigation and the arrest. Once during the defense's case, when Thomas's lawyer tried to argue that his client was mentally ill and couldn't understand the nature of his actions. I'll never forget sitting in that witness box, looking out at the packed courtroom. The families of the victims were there. Children and grandchildren who thought their loved ones had died natural deaths, who were now learning that their final moments had been stolen by a man they'd trusted. Some of them were crying. Others just stared at Thomas with a hatred so pure it was almost tangible. Thomas himself sat perfectly still throughout most of the trial, occasionally taking notes or whispering to his attorney. He looked like any other healthcare worker you might see, clean-cut, professional, the kind of person you'd trust with your life or the life of someone you loved. That's what made it so much worse, I think. Evil isn't supposed to look so ordinary. The prosecutor, District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, was methodical in her presentation. She walked the jury through each murder, using Thomas's own notes and recordings from his confession to show the premeditated nature of his crimes. She brought in expert witnesses to explain how he'd used his medical knowledge to kill his victims in ways that would appear natural. She painted a picture of a predator who'd used his position as a healer to become an angel of death. But it was during the defense's case that Thomas finally took the stand in his own defense. His attorney, a public defender named Robert Klein, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to present Thomas as a mentally ill man who'd genuinely believed he was helping people. "Mr. Carver," Klein said, "can you explain to the jury what you thought you were doing when you visited these patients?" Thomas looked directly at the jury, his voice calm and clear. "I was providing end-of-life care. These people were suffering, and the medical system had abandoned them. They were alone, frightened and in pain. I was offering them dignity in their final moments. Did you believe you were helping them? I knew I was helping them. I could see the peace in their faces when the suffering ended. I could feel their gratitude." That's when D.A. Martinez stood up for cross-examination. She was a small woman, maybe 5'3", but she had a presence that filled the courtroom when she spoke. "Mr. Carver, you've testified that you believed you were helping these people. Is that correct?" "Yes. And you made the decision about who needed your help based on your own assessment of their quality of life." "Based on their suffering, yes. Their suffering as you perceived it. As I observed it, I'm trained to assess patient distress. Mr. Carver, did any of these patients ask you to end their lives?" Thomas paused for a moment. "They didn't need to ask. I could see what they needed. So the answer is no. None of them asked you to kill them. They asked for help with their pain. I provided it, by murdering them, by ending their suffering." Martinez walked closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Carver, let me ask you about something else. During your confession to the police, you mentioned that some patients weren't ready yet. Do you remember saying that?" "Yes. What did you mean by that?" "Some patients still had hope, still had reasons to continue fighting. And you were the one who decided when that hope was gone? I was trained to recognize when continued treatment was futile. Mr. Carver, you weren't providing medical treatment, you were committing murder. I was providing mercy." That's when Martinez asked the question that changed everything for me. "Mr. Carver, in your apartment, police found a notebook with 47 names in it. These were patients you were monitoring for potential future intervention. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Some of these patients are still alive, are they not?" "Yes." "And some of them have family members who love them, who visit them regularly, who would be devastated if they died. Family members often have difficulty accepting when it's time to let go. So, you would have killed people whose families loved them and wanted them alive. If their suffering became too great, yes. Regardless of what their families wanted? Families don't always understand what's best for the patient." Martinez paused, letting that sink in with the jury. Then she asked the question that still keeps me awake at night. "Mr. Carver, how do you decide when someone has lived long enough?" Thomas looked thoughtful, as if this was a perfectly reasonable question that deserved careful consideration. "It's not about how long they've lived," he said. "It's about the quality of their remaining life. When someone is alone, when their health is declining, when they're becoming a burden to themselves and others, that's when mercy becomes appropriate." "A burden to others?" "Yes. Children who have to visit out of obligation. Healthcare workers who have to provide care they know is futile. Society that has to support people who are no longer contributing. So, elderly people who require care are burdens? When they're suffering, yes. And you appointed yourself to decide when that burden should be eliminated. I accepted the responsibility that others were unwilling to accept." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing and was staring at Thomas with her mouth open. Mr. Carver, Martinez continued, do you believe you have the right to decide who lives and who dies? I believe I have the responsibility to end unnecessary suffering. That's not what I asked. Do you believe you have the right to decide who lives and who dies? Thomas met her gaze without flinching. Someone has to make those decisions. The medical establishment is too cowardly. Families are too selfish. Patients are too confused. Someone has to have the courage to do what's necessary. So the answer is yes. You believe you have the right to decide who lives and who dies. I believe I have the obligation. That's when I understood the full scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just a man who'd killed 12 elderly patients. This was someone who genuinely believed he was justified in deciding who deserved to live and who deserved to die. Someone who saw himself not as a murderer, but as a savior. The jury found him guilty on all counts after deliberating for less than 4 hours. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively for each count of murder. Mathematically, it worked out to over 300 years. But as they led him away in shackles, Thomas turned and looked directly at me. And he smiled. Not a malicious smile, not a threatening smile. A grateful smile, like I'd done him a favor. Later, his attorney told me that Thomas had said something to him right before sentencing. He'd said he was proud of his work, and that he hoped someone would continue it while he was in prison. He'd said there were so many people suffering needlessly, and so few people willing to help them find peace. That was 4 years ago. Thomas Carver is still in prison, will be for the rest of his life. The hospital implemented new security protocols around patient information. The families of his victims filed wrongful death lawsuits and eventually settled out of court. Life in Millbrook went back to normal, more or less. But for me, nothing has been the same since. I started smoking again after the trial. Hadn't touched a cigarette in 8 years, but something about Thomas Carver's smile as they led him away made me need something to calm my nerves. My wife, Linda, she understood at first. The stress of the case, the media attention, the way the whole thing had consumed my life for months. She figured I'd work through it and get back to normal. But I couldn't get back to normal, because normal meant going back to patrol, back to responding to calls, back to trusting that the people in positions of authority and care were actually there to help people. And I couldn't do that anymore. Every welfare check felt like a potential crime scene. Every elderly person I encountered made me wonder if someone was watching them, cataloging their vulnerabilities, deciding whether they were worth keeping alive. I'd find myself asking detailed questions about their medical care, their recent hospital stays, their home nursing services. My supervisors started getting complaints that I was being too invasive, too suspicious, spending too much time on routine calls. Mike, you need to talk to someone, Sergeant Williams told me about 6 months after the trial. This case got to you, it got to all of us, but you're letting it change how you do your job. He was right, but I couldn't explain to him what was really bothering me. It wasn't just that Thomas Carver had killed 12 people. It was that he'd been doing it for 2 years before anyone noticed. It was that 5 more people had died after his killing spree began, and their deaths had been written off as natural. It was that there were 47 names in his notebook, and we'd only caught him because he'd gotten careless with 4 of them. How many other Thomas Carvers were out there? How many healthcare workers had decided they knew better than their patients about when life was worth living? How many deaths that we'd accepted as natural were actually murders we'd never investigated? I started doing research in my spare time. I'd go to the library after my shifts and read through medical journals, newspaper archives, anything I could find about healthcare workers who'd killed patients. What I found terrified me. There was Harold Shipman in England, who killed over 200 patients over a 23-year career. There was Charles Cullen in New Jersey, who murdered at least 40 patients in multiple hospitals. There was Orville Lynn Majors in Indiana, who killed at least 6 patients and was suspected in dozens more deaths. There was Kristen Gilbert in Massachusetts, who caused cardiac emergencies in patients so she could be the hero who saved them. Except sometimes she didn't bother with the saving part. The pattern was always the same. Healthcare workers in positions of trust, usually targeting the most vulnerable patients, the elderly, the terminally ill, the ones with no family or advocates. They'd work for years, sometimes decades before anyone noticed, and when they were finally caught, investigators would discover that the death rate in their units had been significantly higher than normal, but no one had thought to investigate because the victims were already sick. I brought my research to Detective Walsh, hoping she'd see what I was seeing, but she just looked at me with concern. "Mike, you caught him. Thomas Carver is in prison. The case is closed." "But what about the others? What about the pattern?" "What others? You're talking about cases from different states, different countries. There's no connection to our jurisdiction. There's a connection to the method, to the victims, to the way these people operate. Mike, you're seeing patterns where there aren't any. You're letting this case consume you." But I couldn't let it go. Because 3 months after Thomas Carver was sentenced, we had another case. Mrs. Emily Thornton, 81 years old, found dead in her bed by her daughter, who'd come for a scheduled visit. Natural causes, according to the initial assessment. Heart failure. She'd been discharged from Millbrook General just 2 weeks earlier after treatment for pneumonia. I wasn't assigned to the case. It was handled by the day shift. And since there were no signs of foul play, it was barely investigated at all. But something about it bothered me. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the fact that she'd been a patient at the same hospital where Thomas had worked. Maybe it was just paranoia. I drove by Mrs. Thornton's house on my patrol that night. 892 Cedar Street. A small bungalow with a neat front yard and a "for sale" sign that her daughter had probably already put up. I sat in my patrol car and tried to imagine Thomas Carver standing outside her bedroom window, calling her name in the darkness. The next day, I requested a copy of the incident report. Mrs. Thornton had been found by her daughter, Rebecca, who had a key and visited every Tuesday and Friday. Rebecca told the responding officer that her mother had seemed fine when she'd visited the previous Friday, maybe a little tired, but recovering well from her hospital stay. She was actually in good spirits, Rebecca had said, talking about getting back to her garden, maybe taking a trip to visit her sister in Florida. She seemed like she was getting her strength back. But something in the report caught my attention. Rebecca mentioned that her mother had been confused about her medication schedule since coming home from the hospital. She'd been taking her pills at the wrong times, sometimes forgetting doses entirely. A visiting nurse had been scheduled to help her, but the appointment had been canceled at the last minute. I called Rebecca Thornton and asked if I could meet with her. She was surprised to hear from the police again, but agreed to see me at her mother's house the next day. Rebecca was a woman in her 50s, still clearly grieving but trying to hold herself together as she dealt with the practical matters of her mother's death. She let me into the house, which still smelled like her mother's perfume, and the lavender sachets she'd kept in all the drawers. "I don't understand why the police are interested," Rebecca said as we sat in the living room. "The doctor said it was her heart. She'd had problems before. I'm just following up on a few details. You mentioned that your mother was having trouble with her medications?" "Yes, ever since she came home from the hospital. She'd been managing fine before, but something about the hospital stay confused her. She kept talking about a nurse who'd promised to help her remember when to take everything." My pulse quickened. "A nurse?" Yes, a night nurse. She said he was so kind, so helpful. He'd written out a schedule for her, explained everything carefully. But when she got home, she couldn't remember what he'd told her, and the schedule he'd given her didn't match what the doctor had prescribed. Do you remember his name? She called him Thomas. Thomas something. She was quite taken with him, said he was the only one at the hospital who really seemed to care about her as a person. Thomas Carver had been in prison for 8 months when Mrs. Thornton died, but the pattern was exactly the same. An elderly patient, confused about medications, visited by a caring night nurse named Thomas, who took special interest in her case. Rebecca, was your mother's back door unlocked when you found her? She looked puzzled by the question. Yes, actually. That was strange, because she was always so careful about locking up. I asked her about it once, and she said the nurse had told her it was important to leave it unlocked in case of emergencies. I felt ice in my veins. What nurse? The visiting nurse who was supposed to help with her medications. Though the appointment was canceled, Mother said he'd come by anyway just to check on her. Said he was concerned about patients who lived alone. Rebecca, did your mother ever mention this nurse's name? She called him Thomas, too. Said he reminded her of the nurse from the hospital. Same kind bedside manner, same concern for her well-being. I left Mrs. Thornton's house and drove straight to Millbrook General. I needed to know if there was another Thomas working the night shift. I needed to know if we'd missed something, if there was a partner or copycat we hadn't identified. Helen Martinez, the nursing supervisor, was still working there, though she looked like she'd aged 5 years in the 8 months since Thomas Carver's arrest. Officer Brennan, she said when she saw me, I hope you're not here about another case. I need to check your current staffing. Do you have any nurses named Thomas working night shifts? Number. After what happened, we've been very careful about our hiring. Background checks, psychological evaluations, references going back years. We only have 2 Thomases on staff and they both work day shifts. What about visiting nurses? Home health care services. That would be through the hospital's home care division. Different department entirely. She gave me the contact information for the home care director, a woman named Patricia Holmes, who agreed to meet with me that afternoon. The home care offices were in a separate building across the street from the main hospital, a converted house that had been turned into medical offices. Patricia Holmes was a stern-looking woman in her 60s who seemed to view my questions with suspicion and barely concealed irritation. We don't have any nurses named Thomas, she said flatly. Haven't for over a year. What about independent contractors? People who might be working for multiple agencies? Officer, our nurses are all licensed, bonded, and thoroughly vetted. We don't use random contractors. Mrs. Holmes, I'm investigating the death of Emily Thornton. Her daughter said a visiting nurse named Thomas had been scheduled to help with medication management, but the appointment was canceled. Patricia's expression changed from irritation to concern. We never had an appointment scheduled for Emily Thornton. I remember that case specifically because her daughter called asking about it, but we never received a referral for home care services. Then, who scheduled the appointment that was canceled? That's what I'd like to know. That's when I realized we'd been looking at this all wrong. Thomas Carver hadn't been working alone. Someone else was out there using his methods, his approach, his name. Someone who knew enough about his case to replicate it perfectly. And whoever it was, they were still out there. Still watching. Still deciding who lived and who died. I spent the next 2 weeks digging into Emily Thornton's death like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. I requested the autopsy report, even though she'd already been buried. I interviewed her neighbors, her doctors, anyone who might have seen this mysterious visiting nurse named Thomas. And slowly, a picture began to emerge that scared me more than anything Thomas Carver had done. Mrs. Thornton's neighbor, an elderly man named Frank Kowalski, who lived across the street, remembered seeing a man in scrubs visiting her house 3 times in the 2 weeks before she died. Always late at night, always alone, always carrying what looked like a medical bag. I figured it was the visiting nurse, Frank told me as we stood on his front porch, looking across at Emily's empty house. Emily had mentioned she was getting help with her medications. Nice young man, she said, very professional. Can you describe him? Average height, maybe, thin building, light hair, drove a white car, looked like a Honda or Toyota, one of those economy cars. Did you ever see his face clearly? Not really. It was always dark when he came by, but Emily seemed comfortable with him. I saw her let him in through the back door a couple times. The back door. The same entry point Thomas Carver had used. I checked with the state licensing board to see if there were any visiting nurses named Thomas who'd been registered in our area in the past year. They gave me a list of 17 possibilities, but when I cross-referenced them with current employment records, all of them were accounted for. They were all working legitimate jobs at hospitals, nursing homes, or established home care agencies. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a licensed nurse at all. I went back to the prison to interview Thomas Carver. I hadn't seen him since the trial, and I wasn't sure what to expect. The Thomas Carver who sat across from me in the visitor's room looked older, thinner, but still had that same unsettling calmness in his eyes. "Officer Brennan," he said, smiling as if I was an old friend. "I wondered when you'd come to see me. I'm investigating another death. Emily Thornton. Ring any bells?" His smile widened. "I read about it in the newspaper. Natural causes, they said. Peaceful death in her sleep. Sounds like someone finally learned from my example. Thomas, who else knew about your methods? Did you ever discuss your work with anyone? My work? You mean my calling? Did you ever mentor anyone? Train anyone? Share your techniques?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those pale eyes. "Officer Brennan, are you asking if I had an apprentice? I'm asking if you told anyone else how to identify vulnerable patients, how to gain their trust, how to access their homes. And why would you think that? Because someone is copying your methods. Someone who knows exactly how you operated." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his words carefully. "Officer Brennan, do you know what the most beautiful thing about mercy is? I'm not here for a philosophy lesson, Thomas. The most beautiful thing about mercy is that it's contagious. When people see true compassion in action, they want to emulate it. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Who, Thomas? Who wanted to emulate you? There were so many people at the hospital who understood what I was trying to do. Other nurses who saw the suffering I was alleviating. Administrators who noticed how peaceful the deaths were in my unit. Family members who were grateful that their loved ones didn't have to endure prolonged suffering. Give me names. I couldn't possibly remember all of them, but I will say this. You'd be surprised how many people support what I did once they understand the true nature of mercy." That's when he leaned forward, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Officer Brennan, do you know who visits me here? Who writes me letters? Who tells me about the work that continues in my absence?" My blood went cold. What work? The work of compassion. The work of ending unnecessary suffering. The work that you tried so hard to stop, but that's bigger than any one person. Thomas, who is continuing your work? He sat back and smiled that same serene smile I'd seen at his sentencing. Someone who learned from my mistakes. Someone who's more careful about leaving evidence. Someone who understands that the work is too important to be stopped by one arrest. I need a name, Thomas. I'm afraid I can't help you with that, Officer Brennan. But I will tell you this. Emily Thornton's death was beautiful, peaceful, dignified. Everything death should be. She was murdered. She was saved. I left the prison with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Thomas Carver knew who was copying his methods, and he approved. Worse, he seemed to view it as vindication of his twisted philosophy. I went back to Detective Walsh with everything I'd found, but she remained skeptical. Mike, you have one suspicious death and a convicted killer who's playing mind games with you. That's not evidence of a copycat. Sarah, the pattern is identical. The victim profile, the method of approach, the point of entry. The pattern you're seeing might be coincidence. Emily Thornton was elderly, sick and confused about her medications. She could have died of natural causes. Then why was her back door unlocked? Why did her neighbor see a fake visiting nurse 3 times before she died? Maybe she was confused and unlocked it herself. Maybe the neighbor was mistaken about what he saw. But I knew she was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, the same way I'd felt it during those first welfare checks that had led us to Thomas Carver. Someone was out there, using his methods, targeting the same vulnerable population. And they were getting away with it because everyone wanted to believe the Thomas Carver case was closed. That night, I was driving through the older part of town when I saw him. A man in scrubs, walking up the front path of a small house on Willow Street. Average height, thin build, carrying what looked like a medical bag. He moved with purpose, like someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to be making a house call at 11:30 p.m. I pulled over and watched as he walked around to the back of the house. A few minutes later, I saw a light come on in what looked like a bedroom window. Then it went dark again. I called for backup and approached the house on foot. The address was 634 Willow Street, a tidy little bungalow with flower boxes under the windows and a well-maintained garden. Through the back window, I could see movement inside. 2 figures, one standing, one lying down. That's when I heard the voice. Soft, gentle, reassuring. "It's okay, Mrs. Patterson. I'm here to help you. Just relax. This won't hurt at all." Mrs. Patterson, Agnes Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been one of Thomas Carver's intended victims. The one who'd called 911 when he tried to break into her house on Elm Drive. I drew my weapon and tried the back door. It was unlocked. "Police! Don't move!" The man in scrubs spun around, and in the dim light from the bedside lamp, I could see his face clearly for the first time. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that would make any elderly person feel safe opening their door to him. In his hand was a syringe filled with clear liquid. Mrs. Patterson was lying in her bed, her eyes closed, breathing shallow but steady. An IV line ran from her arm to a bag of what looked like saline solution hanging from a makeshift stand. "Step away from the patient," I ordered, keeping my gun trained on him. "Officer, you don't understand," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I'm providing end-of-life care. Mrs. Patterson is suffering. I'm helping her find peace. Put the syringe down and step away from the bed." Instead, he looked down at Mrs. Patterson with what could only be described as tenderness. "She's been so brave," he said. "Living alone all these years, managing her pain, pretending everything was fine. But I can see the truth. I can see how ready she is. Put it down now." He looked back at me, and I saw the same expression I'd seen in Thomas Carver's eyes during his confession. The absolute certainty of someone who believed they were doing God's work. "My name is David," he said. "David Thomas. I've been continuing the work that Thomas Carver started." Someone had to, David Thomas. He'd taken Thomas's first name as his last name. "How many, David? How many have you killed?" "I've helped 7 people find peace since Thomas was arrested. 7 people who were suffering unnecessarily. 7 people whose families are now grateful that their loved ones didn't have to endure prolonged agony." Backup arrived just as he raised the syringe toward Mrs. Patterson's 4th line. I had a split second to make a decision, try to talk him down or stop him permanently. I chose to shoot him in the shoulder, hoping to disable him without killing him. He dropped the syringe and fell to the floor, screaming about how I'd doomed Mrs. Patterson to continued suffering. Mrs. Patterson survived. The syringe contained enough morphine to kill a horse. David Thomas, after surgery to repair his shoulder, confessed to 7 murders and had detailed plans for 12 more. Like his mentor, he'd been targeting elderly patients who lived alone, using his knowledge as a former nursing student to gain access to patient information and home addresses. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. When we searched David Thomas's apartment, we found letters, dozens of them, from people all across the country who'd read about Thomas Carver's case and wanted to continue his work. People who called themselves mercy providers and compassion angels. People who believed that they had the right to decide when someone had lived long enough. David Thomas wasn't just a copycat. He was part of a network. That was 2 years ago. David Thomas is serving life in prison, same as his mentor. The letters we found led to investigations in 6 other states, resulting in 4 more arrests. But I know there are others out there. Others who read about these cases and see inspiration instead of horror. Others who look at elderly people, disabled people, sick people, and see burdens that need to be eliminated. I left the force 6 months ago. Couldn't do the job anymore, knowing what I know. Now, I work private security, and I spend my free time researching suspicious deaths in nursing homes and hospitals, looking for patterns, watching for the signs, because the most terrifying thing about Thomas Carver and David Thomas isn't that they were monsters. It's that they were ordinary people who convinced themselves they were heroes. And there are more of them out there. More people who think compassion means deciding who deserves to live and who deserves to die. Every time I read about an elderly person found dead peacefully in their bed, every time I see a story about someone dying quietly at home after a hospital stay, I wonder if it was really natural causes, or if someone stood over them in the darkness, calling their name, telling them it was time to go. If you're listening to this and you work in healthcare, or you know someone who does, watch for the signs. Watch for the people who get too attached to their patients. Watch for the ones who talk about ending suffering and providing dignity. Watch for the ones who know too much about their patients' personal lives, who remember details that seem insignificant but paint a picture of vulnerability. And if you're elderly, if you live alone, if you've been in the hospital recently, be careful who you trust. Be careful who you give your spare key to. Be careful about the voices calling your name in the darkness. Because sometimes the people who claim they're trying to help you are actually deciding whether you deserve to live. My name is Officer Sarah Chen, and I've been with the Spokane County Sheriff's Department for 8 years now. What I'm about to tell you happened on February 14th, 2019, during one of the worst blizzards Washington State had seen in decades. I've told this story to Internal Affairs, to the department psychologist, and to my partner who's been trying to get me to talk about it for months. But this is the first time I'm putting it all down in one place, start to finish, exactly as it happened. Some people think I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. But I know what I saw that night and I know what I experienced, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. I'd been working the night shift for 3 years by then, mostly patrolling the rural highways around Spokane County. It's quiet work usually, a few drunk drivers, some domestic calls, the occasional accident. Nothing that would prepare you for what I went through that February night. The storm had been building for days, and by the time I clocked in at 10 p.m., the Weather Service was calling it a once-in-a-decade event. Temperatures were dropping to 15 below zero, with wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. The snow was falling so thick you could barely see 20 feet ahead of you. Most of the other units had been called back to the station, but I volunteered to stay out for one more patrol run along Highway 395. I'd always been good in bad weather, confident in my driving, and I figured someone should be out there in case anyone got stranded. Looking back, I think part of me liked the isolation. There's something about being the only person on the road during a storm like that. Being the one person between civilization and chaos. It made me feel important, necessary. I'd been going through a rough patch with my husband at the time, and work was the one place where I felt like I had control, like I was making a difference. The radio chatter had died down to almost nothing by midnight, just the occasional status check from dispatch. Even the truckers who usually ran through the night had pulled off to wait out the storm. It was just me, my patrol car, and about 50 miles of highway that needed watching. The first sign that something was wrong came around 12:30 a.m. I was driving north on 395, about 10 miles outside of Deer Park, when my radio started picking up interference. At first, I thought it was just the storm affecting the signal, but there was something strange about the static. It almost sounded like voices, like people talking in a language I couldn't understand. I tried adjusting the frequency, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get clear communication back to dispatch. That should have been my first warning to head back, but I was stubborn. I figured I'd complete my patrol route and check in when I got to the next relay tower. The snow was getting heavier and the wind was picking up. My headlights were barely cutting through the white wall in front of me, and I'd slowed down to maybe 25 miles per hour. That's when I saw the first set of tire tracks. They were fresh, maybe an hour old, heading north like I was. But what struck me as odd was that they were perfectly straight. No weaving or sliding like you'd expect from someone driving in these conditions. It was like whoever was driving had perfect control, even in the worst weather I'd ever seen. I followed the tracks for about 5 miles, and then they just stopped. Not at a driveway or a side road, just stopped in the middle of the highway like the car had been lifted straight up into the air. I pulled over and got out to investigate. The wind hit me like a physical blow, and the snow was stinging my face even through my winter gear. I used my flashlight to examine the tracks more carefully. They were definitely from a standard passenger car, probably a compact sedan based on the tire size, but the more I looked at them, the more confused I became. The tracks were too perfect, too consistent. In snow this deep and with wind this strong, even the most skilled driver would have left some evidence of fighting for control. These tracks looked like they'd been made by a machine, not a human being. I was so focused on the tire tracks that I almost missed the car itself. It was sitting about a quarter mile ahead, just barely visible through the snow. A red Honda Civic, maybe 10 years old, pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The engine was running, sending up a steady stream of exhaust that the wind was whipping away almost immediately. I got back in my patrol car and drove up behind it, running the plates through the system. The car was registered to a Marcus Webb, address in Seattle. No warrants, no red flags, just a regular guy who'd apparently gotten caught in the storm. I approached the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. The windows were fogged up from the inside, but I could see the outline of someone in the driver's seat. "Police!" I called out. "Everything okay in there?" There was no response, so I tried the door handle. It was unlocked, which surprised me. Most people lock their doors when they're stranded on the highway, especially at night. I opened the door and immediately felt the warm air from inside the car. The heater was running full blast, and there was soft music playing on the radio. The man in the driver's seat was probably in his 40s, wearing a business suit and tie. He had dark hair, neatly combed, and he was staring straight ahead through the windshield. For a moment, I thought he might be in shock or hypothermic, but when I touched his shoulder, I realized something was very wrong. He wasn't moving at all, wasn't even breathing. His skin was cold to the touch, but not the kind of cold you'd expect from someone who'd been sitting in a car with the heater running. It was a different kind of cold, like he'd been dead for hours. "Sir," I said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing. His eyes were open, but they had that glassy, unfocused look that I'd seen before at accident scenes. I checked for a pulse at his wrist, then at his neck. Nothing. Marcus Webb was dead, but his car was warm, his engine was running, and he was sitting upright in the driver's seat like he'd just pulled over for a rest. I started to reach for my radio to call for backup and an ambulance, but that's when I saw the note. It was folded neatly and placed on the dashboard, right in front of the steering wheel where I couldn't miss it. My name was written on the outside in careful block letters. Officer Sarah Chen. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and unfolded it. The message inside was short and written in the same careful handwriting. "You're next. Check the basement at 1247 Pine Street. You should have checked the basement." I stared at that note for a long time, trying to make sense of it. How could a dead man have written a note addressed to me specifically? And what was this about a basement on Pine Street? I'd been on plenty of calls to Pine Street over the years, but I couldn't remember any specific incident involving a basement. But there was something about the address that felt familiar, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite remember. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, then began a more thorough examination of the scene. The car was clean, no signs of struggle or violence. Marcus Webb's wallet was in his jacket pocket, containing his driver's license, credit cards, and about $60 in cash. There was a photo of a woman and 2 young children, probably his family. In the back seat, I found a laptop bag and what looked like sales materials for some kind of pharmaceutical company. Everything suggested a normal businessman who'd gotten caught in the storm on his way home from a work trip. But the more I looked around, the more questions I had. Where were the footprints? The snow around the car was completely undisturbed except for my own tracks. If Marcus Webb had pulled over and died in his car, there should have been some sign of how he'd gotten there, some indication of movement around the vehicle. But it was like the car had materialized out of thin air, with him already dead inside. I tried my radio again, but I was still getting nothing but static and what sounded like distant voices. I couldn't make out any words, but there was definitely someone talking. The voices seemed to be getting clearer, more distinct, and I realized with a chill that one of them sounded like my own voice. Not exactly like me, but close enough to be disturbing. I turned the volume down and tried to focus on the scene in front of me. The sensible thing to do would have been to secure the scene and wait for backup, but I was getting more uneasy by the minute. There was something about the whole situation that felt wrong, like I was missing something obvious. I decided to search the car more thoroughly, starting with the glove compartment. Inside, I found the usual stuff: registration, insurance papers, a few maps. But underneath the maps I found another note, this one written on different paper in what looked like a different handwriting. This note was addressed to the officer who finds this car, and the message was even more disturbing than the first one. It read, "Marcus Webb died 3 days ago. The man in the driver's seat isn't Marcus Webb. Look at his face again, look at his hands. You know who he really is." I looked back at the body in the driver's seat, and for a moment, I could have sworn his head had turned slightly, like he was looking at me. But when I focused on him directly, he was in the same position as before, staring straight ahead. I was starting to feel genuinely scared now, not just confused. I'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that dead bodies don't move on their own, don't write notes, and definitely don't address those notes to specific officers. But I also knew that stress and isolation could play tricks on your mind, especially during extreme weather conditions. I tried to stay focused on the facts, on what I could observe and document. The problem was, the facts weren't making sense. I took out my flashlight and examined the dead man's face more carefully. He looked like the photo on Marcus Webb's driver's license, but there was something slightly off about the features. The nose was a little different, the jawline not quite right, and his hands, when I looked at them closely, seemed wrong too. They were too pale, too smooth, like they'd never done a day's work. But more than that, they seemed familiar, like I'd seen them before somewhere. I was so focused on studying the body that I almost missed the sound of another car approaching. Through the snow, I could see headlights coming from the south, moving slowly but steadily in my direction. I felt a wave of relief, thinking it might be backup finally arriving. But as the car got closer, I realized it wasn't a patrol car. It was another civilian vehicle, a dark SUV that looked like it was struggling with the road conditions. The SUV pulled up behind my patrol car and stopped. I could see someone moving around inside, but the windows were tinted, and I couldn't make out any details. I walked back toward the SUV, my hand instinctively moving to my service weapon. The driver's side window rolled down, and I found myself looking at a middle-aged man with gray hair and a concerned expression. "Officer, thank God you're here," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "I've been driving for hours trying to find help. My name is Dr. Richard Mason, and I'm a psychiatrist from Seattle. I received a call about a patient of mine who might be in danger, and I was told he was last seen heading north on this highway." I felt my heart skip a beat. "What's your patient's name?" "Marcus Webb," Dr. Mason replied. "He's been struggling with some serious mental health issues, and he left Seattle 3 days ago in a very disturbed state. His family is worried sick about him." I looked back at the Honda Civic, then at Dr. Mason. "Sir, I need to ask you to step out of your vehicle. I've found Mr. Webb, and this is now a crime scene." Dr. Mason's expression changed, becoming more serious. "Is he alive?" "No, sir, he's deceased. I need to ask you some questions about your patient's mental state and his recent activities." Dr. Mason nodded and got out of his SUV. He was a tall man, well-dressed despite the weather, wearing an expensive-looking coat and boots. As he walked toward me, I noticed that his footsteps in the snow seemed unusually light, barely leaving an impression in the deep powder. "Officer Chen," he said, and I froze. I hadn't told him my name. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my hand moving to my weapon. Dr. Mason smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring expression. "Marcus told me about you. He talked about you quite a bit, actually. He said you were the officer who was supposed to save him, but you failed. He said you didn't check the basement." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pine Street, the basement. Suddenly, the memory came flooding back, clear as day. February 14th, 2018. Exactly 1 year ago. I'd been dispatched to a domestic violence call at 1247 Pine Street. A woman had called, screaming that her husband was threatening her with a knife. I'd arrived at the scene to find the house dark and apparently empty. I'd knocked on the door, called out, but gotten no response. I'd tried the door and found it unlocked, so I'd entered to investigate. the house had been completely silent. No signs of struggle, no indication that anyone was home. I'd searched the main floor thoroughly, checking every room, every closet. I'd called out repeatedly, but heard nothing. The basement door had been closed, and I'd assumed it was just a utility room. I'd rattled the handle, found it locked, and moved on. After 20 minutes of searching, I'd concluded that it was a false alarm and left the scene. But now, standing in the snow with Dr. Mason staring at me with those strange, knowing eyes, I remembered something else. As I'd been leaving the house, I'd heard something. A faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on wood. I'd paused at the door, listening, but it had stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling, old pipes or something. I'd filed my report and moved on to the next call. "You remember now," Dr. Mason said, his voice soft but somehow threatening. "You remember the sound from the basement. Marcus was down there, Officer Chen. He was tied up, beaten, left to die while his captor went to get more supplies. He was knocking on the floor above his head, begging for help. And you heard him. You heard him, but you left anyway." I was shaking now, both from the cold and from the realization of what I'd failed to do. I didn't know. The door was locked. I thought the house was empty. "The door wasn't locked," Dr. Mason said. "It was just stuck. One good push would have opened it. But you didn't try, did you? You just walked away." I looked back at the Honda Civic, at the body of Marcus Webb sitting in the driver's seat. But something had changed. The body wasn't facing forward anymore. It was turned slightly toward me, and I could swear that the eyes were looking directly at me. "That's not possible," I whispered. Dr. Mason followed my gaze. "What's not possible, Officer Chen?" He moved. The body moved. "Bodies don't move on their own," Dr. Mason said calmly. "Unless they're not really dead, unless they're just waiting for the right moment to wake up." I drew my weapon, pointing it at Dr. Mason. "Stay back. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this ends now." Dr. Mason laughed, a sound that seemed to echo strangely in the snow-muffled landscape. "You think you can shoot your way out of guilt, Officer Chen? You think you can arrest your own conscience?" The radio in my patrol car suddenly crackled to life, and I heard my own voice coming through the speaker. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I'm at 1247 Pine Street conducting a welfare check. The residence appears to be empty. No sign of the complainant or any disturbance. I'm clearing the scene." But that wasn't what I'd said that night. I'd never mentioned the basement in my report, never said anything about hearing noises or having doubts. The voice on the radio was saying what I should have said, what I would have said if I'd been honest about what I'd experienced. "That's not what happened," I said, but my voice sounded weak, uncertain. "Isn't it?" Dr. Mason asked. "Are you sure?" "Memory is a funny thing, Officer Chen. Sometimes we remember what we want to remember, not what actually happened." I was backing away from him now, toward my patrol car, but as I moved, I realized that the Honda Civic was no longer where I'd left it. It was directly behind me, blocking my path. The engine was still running, the exhaust still steaming in the cold air, and Marcus Webb was no longer in the driver's seat. I spun around looking for him, and saw him standing about 10 feet away in the snow. He was wearing the same business suit, but now it was torn and dirty, stained with what looked like blood. His face was pale, almost blue, and his eyes were wide with terror and accusation. "You left me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly through the wind. "You heard me calling for help, and you left me to die." "I didn't know," I said. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I had known, on some level. I'd heard that knocking, felt that something was wrong, but I'd chosen to ignore it. I'd chosen the easy path, the path that didn't require me to break down doors or file complicated reports. "You knew," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "You knew, and you chose to walk away. You chose to let me die." Dr. Mason was circling around behind me now, and I realized that I was trapped between the two of them. My patrol car was blocked by the Honda, and the only way out was through the deep snow on either side of the highway. In these conditions, I wouldn't get far on foot. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Justice," Marcus said simply. "I want you to experience what I experienced. I want you to know what it feels like to be abandoned, to be left to die while someone who could help you just walks away." I raised my weapon, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't keep it steady. "Stay back. Both of you, stay back. You can't shoot us, Officer Chen," Dr. Mason said. "We're already dead. We died a year ago. In that basement you were too lazy to check." "But you're not dead," I said. "You're right here. You're talking to me." "Are we?" Marcus asked. "Or are you just talking to yourself?" I looked around, suddenly confused. The snow was falling harder now, and I could barely see anything beyond the immediate area around the two cars. The wind was howling, drowning out all other sounds. And I realized that I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard my radio, couldn't remember the last time I'd had any contact with the outside world. "How long have I been out here?" I asked. "Hours," Dr. Mason said. "Days. Does it matter?" "Time. Works differently when you're alone with your guilt." I looked at my watch, but the face was fogged up and I couldn't read it. I tried to remember what time it had been when I'd found the Honda, but I couldn't. It felt like it had been minutes ago, but also like it had been forever. "This isn't real," I said. "None of this is real." "What's real?" Marcus asked. "Is the guilt real? Is the memory of walking away real? Is the knowledge that you could have saved me real?" I didn't have an answer for that, because the guilt was real, the memory was real, and the knowledge that I'd failed was real, even if everything else might not be. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words felt inadequate, pathetic. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring me back," Marcus said. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did." "Then what do you want from me?" "I want you to check the basement," Dr. Mason said. "I want you to go back to 1247 Pine Street and check the basement. I want you to see what you would have found if you'd been brave enough to look." I laughed, a bitter sound. "I can't go back. It's been a year. Whatever was in that basement is long gone." "Is it?" Marcus asked. "Are you sure about that?" I looked at the Honda Civic and I noticed something I'd missed before. The license plate was different now. Instead of Washington plates, it had plates from my own patrol car. I looked at my own vehicle and saw that the plates were gone entirely. "That's impossible," I said. "A lot of things are impossible," Dr. Mason said, "but they happen anyway." I was starting to panic now, really panic. Nothing was making sense, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I tried to focus on basic facts, on things I could verify. I was Officer Sarah Chen. I worked for the Spokane County Sheriff's Department. I was on patrol during a blizzard. I had found a dead body in a car. These were facts, solid things I could hold on to. But even as I tried to ground myself in these facts, I felt them slipping away. Was I really on patrol? Was there really a blizzard? Was the body really dead? Or was it just sleeping? Was I really Officer Sarah Chen, or was I someone else entirely? "Who am I?" I asked, the words coming out before I could stop them. "That's the question, isn't it?" Dr. Mason said. "Who are you really? Are you the hero who saves people, or are you the coward who walks away when things get difficult?" I looked at my reflection in the window of the Honda Civic, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The face was pale, drawn, with dark circles under the eyes. The uniform looked wrong, too big, like it belonged to someone else. And the badge, when I looked at it closely, seemed to be made of some kind of dull metal that didn't reflect light properly. "I need to get out of here," I said, backing away from both men. "I need to call for backup." "There is no backup," Marcus said. "There's just you and me and the choice you made a year ago." I turned and ran, plunging into the deep snow beside the highway. The snow was deeper than I'd expected, coming up to my knees, and every step was a struggle. Behind me, I could hear Dr. Mason and Marcus following, their footsteps somehow lighter than mine, barely disturbing the snow. I ran for what felt like hours, but when I looked back, I was still in the same place. The two cars were still there, the two men were still following me, and I was still trapped in this nightmare scenario. The snow was falling harder now, and I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in any direction. Finally, exhausted and freezing, I stopped running. I turned to face my pursuers, and found them standing just a few feet away, looking exactly as they had before. They weren't even breathing hard, and there was no snow on their clothes. "You can't run from this," Dr. Mason said. "You can't run from what you did." "I didn't do anything," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "Exactly," Marcus said. "You didn't do anything. When you could have acted, when you could have saved a life, you chose to do nothing. And that choice has consequences." I sank to my knees in the snow, feeling the cold seeping through my uniform pants. I was tired, so tired that I could barely keep my eyes open. The snow was beautiful in its own way, peaceful and quiet. It would be easy to just lie down and let it cover me, to stop fighting and let the cold take me. "That's right, Doctor," Mason said softly. "Just let go, just stop fighting." "It's easier this way," Marcus added. "No more guilt, no more responsibility, no more choices to make." I closed my eyes and felt the snow starting to accumulate on my shoulders and back. It was tempting, so tempting to just give up. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard another voice, a voice that sounded like my training instructor from the academy. "A police officer never gives up," the voice said. "A police officer fights until the end, no matter what." I opened my eyes and struggled to my feet. Dr. Mason and Marcus were still there, but they seemed less solid somehow, like they were fading around the edges. "I'm not giving up," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I made a mistake, but I'm not giving up." "You can't change the past," Marcus said, but his voice seemed to be coming from farther away now. "No," I agreed, "but I can change what I do next." I walked back toward the highway, toward the two cars that had started this whole nightmare. But as I approached, I saw that they were different now. The Honda Civic was older, rustier, like it had been sitting abandoned for months. And my patrol car looked newer, cleaner, like it had just rolled off the lot. I got into my patrol car and started the engine. The radio crackled to life, and I heard the familiar voice of dispatch. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. What's your status?" "Dispatch, this is Unit 47, I replied. "I'm at mile marker 47 on Highway 395. I need backup and an ambulance at this location." "Copy that, Unit 47. Backup and ambulance en route. ETA 15 minutes. I looked at the Honda Civic one more time. Marcus Webb was back in the driver's seat, but now he looked peaceful, like he was just sleeping. Dr. Mason was nowhere to be seen. The note on the dashboard was gone, and when I checked my pocket, I found that the other note had vanished as well. When backup arrived, they found me sitting in my patrol car, staring at an empty stretch of highway. There was no Honda Civic, no dead body, no mysterious notes, just me. alone in the snow, with no explanation for why I'd called for help. The department psychologist said I'd suffered a stress-related breakdown, brought on by the isolation and extreme weather conditions. She recommended a leave of absence and regular counseling sessions. My sergeant was understanding, said that these things happen sometimes, especially to officers who work alone a lot. But I knew the truth. I knew that I'd been visited by something, whether it was ghosts or guilt or just my own mind trying to process what I'd done, and I knew that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, I drove to 1247 Pine Street. The house was still there, but it was boarded up and marked for demolition. I spoke to the neighbors and they told me about the murder that had happened there the year before. A businessman named Marcus Webb had been kidnapped and held in the basement for 3 days before being killed. The police had found his body eventually, but not until it was too late. I looked up the case files, and I found my own report from that night. It was exactly as I remembered it, describing an empty house with no signs of disturbance. But now I could see what I'd missed, what I'd chosen not to see. The small details that might have led me to check the basement, to find Marcus Webb while he was still alive. I requested a transfer to the detective division, specializing in missing persons cases. I figured if I couldn't save Marcus Webb, maybe I could save someone else. Maybe I could make sure that the next time someone was trapped in a basement calling for help, I would be the one to find them. The nightmares continued for months after that incident on Highway 395. I would dream about snow, about dead bodies in cars, about voices calling for help that I couldn't quite hear. But gradually, they faded. The guilt remained, but it became something I could live with. Something that drove me to be better at my job rather than something that paralyzed me. I never saw Marcus Webb or Dr. Mason again, at least not in the way I'd seen them that night. But sometimes, when I'm working a case, when I'm searching for someone who's missing, I feel like they're there with me, not as accusers or tormentors, but as reminders of what can happen when we choose not to look, not to listen, not to care. 3 years later, I was investigating a missing person case in Spokane. A young woman had disappeared from her apartment, and her family was convinced she'd been kidnapped. The local police had checked the building and found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. They were ready to classify it as a voluntary disappearance. But I remembered Marcus Webb. I remembered the basement I'd failed to check. So I went back to the apartment building and searched it again, more thoroughly this time. And in the basement, behind a false wall that had been recently constructed, I found her. She was alive, barely, but alive. The kidnapper had been planning to move her to a more permanent location, but he'd been delayed by some unrelated business. If I'd waited another day, if I'd accepted the initial search as sufficient, she would have been gone forever. But I didn't wait. I remembered the lesson that Marcus Webb had taught me, even if the way he'd taught it had nearly driven me insane. I think about that night on Highway 395 sometimes, wondering if it really happened or if it was just my mind's way of processing guilt and regret. But in the end, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I learned something from it, that I became a better officer because of it. The snow still makes me nervous, especially when I'm driving alone at night. And I still check my rearview mirror more often than I should, half expecting to see a red Honda Civic following me. But I don't run from it anymore. I've learned to live with the ghosts, real or imagined, that haunt us all. Because in the end, we are all haunted by the choices we make, by the actions we take or fail to take. The question isn't whether we'll be haunted, but whether we'll let those ghosts destroy us or whether we'll let them teach us to be better than we were. I chose to be better. I chose to check the basement every time, no matter how unlikely it seemed that anyone would be there. I chose to listen to the voices calling for help, even when I couldn't quite hear them. I chose to remember Marcus Webb, not as a ghost or a nightmare, but as a reminder of what we owe to each other, what we owe to the people who depend on us to do our jobs. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe that's what Marcus Webb wanted all along. Not revenge or punishment, but simply for someone to remember, to learn, to do better next time. But late at night, when I'm alone in my patrol car and the snow is falling heavy outside, I still wonder. I wonder if that night on Highway 395 really happened, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I wonder if Marcus Webb is really dead, or if he's still out there somewhere, waiting for the next officer who needs to learn the hard way what it means to serve and protect. I wonder if I'm really Officer Sarah Chen, or if I'm someone else entirely. Someone who's been pretending to be a police officer for years without realizing it. I wonder if the woman I saved in that basement was real, or if she was just another hallucination, another manifestation of my guilt and desire for redemption. But then, I remember the feel of her pulse under my fingers, weak but steady. I remember the tears in her eyes when I cut her free from the restraints. I remember the way she said "thank you" over and over again, like it was the only words she knew. That was real. That had to be real. And if that was real, then maybe everything else is real too. Maybe I really am Officer Sarah Chen. Maybe I really did fail Marcus Webb, and maybe I really did learn from that failure. Maybe the ghosts that haunt me are just the price of being human, of caring enough to feel guilty when we fail. Or maybe I'm still sitting in that patrol car on Highway 395, staring at an empty stretch of a highway, slowly freezing to death, while my mind creates elaborate fantasies to avoid facing the truth. Maybe the real Sarah Chen died that night, and everything since then has been the death dream of a woman who couldn't live with her own guilt. I don't know. I may never know. But I know this. Tomorrow night, I'll put on my uniform again. I'll get in my patrol car and drive the dark highways of Spokane County. I'll answer the calls that come in, help the people who need help, and search for the people who are lost. And if I find an abandoned car on the side of the road, if I find a body that shouldn't be there, if I find a note with my name on it, I'll deal with it. Because that's what police officers do. We face the darkness, even when the darkness is inside ourselves. We check the basement every time, no matter how scared we are of what we might find. My name is Officer Jake Morrison, and I've been patrolling the streets of Riverside County, California for 6 years now. I work the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., covering the rural areas east of the city where the suburbs give way to desert and the houses get farther apart. It's usually quiet work, mostly drunk drivers and domestic disturbances, the occasional break-in at one of the vacation homes that rich people from LA keep out here. Nothing that would prepare you for what happened on October 23rd, 2022. Nothing that could prepare anyone for a call like that. I'd been having a rough month personally. My wife, Linda, had filed for divorce in September, and I was living in a studio apartment above a pizza place in downtown Riverside, spending my days off drinking beer and watching TV. The job was the only thing keeping me together, the routine of it, the sense that I was still useful to somebody. Night patrol suited me fine, because it kept me away from people during normal hours, when I might have to pretend everything was okay. Out there in the dark, driving empty roads and answering calls from people who were usually having the worst night of their lives, I could just be a cop. I could focus on other people's problems instead of my own. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I'd just been looking at my watch, counting down the hours until my shift ended. Dispatch said they'd received a 911 call from a residence on Mockingbird Lane, which was way out on the edge of my patrol area, maybe 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. The caller had reported an intruder in the house, said someone was trying to break in through the basement. But when dispatch tried to get more information, the line went dead. They'd been trying to call back for 10 minutes with no response. Mockingbird Lane was a winding dirt road that led up into the hills, lined with expensive houses that people from the city used as weekend retreats. Most of them were empty during the week, which made them attractive targets for burglars who knew the owners wouldn't be back until Friday night. I'd been up that way a few times over the years, usually for false alarms triggered by coyotes or equipment malfunctions. But something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the way dispatch had described the caller's voice, how scared and desperate she'd sounded before the line cut out. The drive took me about 15 minutes, winding up through the hills on roads that weren't much more than fire breaks. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating scrub brush and the occasional reflective eyes of some animal watching from the shadows. The house was at the end of Mockingbird Lane, a big modern place with lots of glass and steel that looked out of place among the desert landscape. There were lights on inside, which was unusual for a house that was supposed to be empty most of the time. I parked at the bottom of the long driveway and called dispatch to let them know I'd arrived. The radio crackled with static, and I had to repeat myself twice before they acknowledged. Cell phone coverage was spotty out here, and the radio signal wasn't much better. I was essentially on my own until I could get back to civilization. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking up the driveway, keeping to the shadows and listening for any sounds that might indicate an intruder was still on the property. The house was bigger than it had looked from the road, maybe 4,000 square feet spread out over 2 levels. The architecture was ultra-modern, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that would give you spectacular views of the valley during the day. But at night, those same windows made the house look exposed and vulnerable, like a fishbowl lit up for anyone to see inside. I could see into what looked like a living room, with expensive furniture and abstract art on the walls. Everything looked normal, no signs of disturbance or struggle. I walked around the perimeter of the house, checking all the ground floor windows and doors. The front door was solid wood with no windows, and it was locked tight. The back door was glass, and I could see through it into a kitchen area. That door was locked too. All the windows I could reach were secure, with no signs of forced entry. If someone had broken in, they'd either been very skilled or they'd had a key. But as I made my way around to the side of the house, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a set of basement windows at ground level, and one of them was broken. The glass had been shattered from the outside, leaving jagged shards around the frame. Fresh glass was scattered on the ground, glittering in my flashlight beam. Someone had definitely broken into this house, and recently. I called dispatch again to report the break-in and request backup, but all I got was static. I was completely on my own, which wasn't unusual for this part of my patrol area, but it made me nervous given the circumstances. I drew my service weapon and approached the broken window, trying to see into the basement. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could hear something moving around down there. Soft footsteps, maybe, or the sound of someone shifting furniture around. The smart thing to do would have been to wait for backup, but the caller had sounded terrified, and if there was still someone in the house who needed help, I couldn't afford to wait. I decided to go in through the front door if I could find a way, rather than climbing through a broken basement window in the dark. I went back to the front of the house and tried the door again, still locked. But as I was standing there, trying to decide what to do next, I heard something that made my decision for me. It was a woman's voice coming from inside the house. She was calling for help, her voice muffled but clearly audible through the walls. "Help me," she was saying. "Please, someone help me. He's in the house. He's coming up from the basement." I didn't hesitate. I kicked in the front door, the wood splintering around the lock as the door swung open. I entered with my weapon drawn, announcing myself loudly. "Police, where are you? Call out to me." The interior of the house was even more impressive than it had looked from outside, with high ceilings and an open floor plan that made my voice echo. But I didn't have time to appreciate the architecture. I could still hear the woman calling for help, and her voice seemed to be coming from upstairs. I found the staircase and started climbing, keeping my back to the wall and my weapon ready. The second floor was a long hallway with several doors leading off it, probably bedrooms and bathrooms. The woman's voice was clearer now, coming from a room at the end of the hall. "In here," she was calling. "Please hurry, I think he's coming up the stairs." I reached the door and tried the handle. It was locked from the inside. "Ma'am, this is Officer Morrison with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Are you injured? Can you unlock the door?" "I can't," she replied, her voice shaking. "I'm tied up. He tied me up and left me here. Please, you have to break down the door. I can hear him on the stairs." I listened carefully, and sure enough, I could hear footsteps on the staircase I'd just climbed. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite succeeding. Someone was definitely in the house with us, and they were heading this way. I kicked in the bedroom door, and it flew open with a crash. The room was dark except for a small lamp on a nightstand, but I could see a woman sitting on the bed. She appeared to be in her 30s with blonde hair and wearing a white nightgown. Her hands were bound behind her back with what looked like rope, and there was duct tape over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was making muffled sounds behind the tape. I holstered my weapon and rushed to her, pulling out my pocket knife to cut the rope around her wrists. But as I got closer, something struck me as wrong. The rope looked new, like it had just been purchased, and the duct tape over her mouth wasn't tight enough to really prevent her from talking. She could have worked it loose if she'd wanted to. But more than that, she didn't look like someone who'd been tied up for hours. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup was fresh, and her nightgown was clean and wrinkle-free. "Ma'am," I said, stopping just out of arm's reach. "What's your name? How long have you been here?" She made more muffled sounds and nodded toward the tape over her mouth. I reached out carefully and pulled it away, ready to jump back if this turned out to be some kind of trap. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice clear and steady now. "My name is Jennifer Walsh. This is my house. A man broke in through the basement a few hours ago. He tied me up and said he was going to rob the place, but then he heard you coming and went back downstairs. Please, you have to cut me loose." I started cutting the rope around her wrists, but I kept my ears open for those footsteps I'd heard on the stairs. The house had gone quiet, which was almost more unnerving than hearing someone moving around. "Did you get a good look at the intruder?" I asked. "Can you describe him?" "He was wearing a mask," Jennifer said, rubbing her wrists as the rope fell away. "But he was tall, maybe 6 feet, and he had dark hair. He said he knew the house would be empty, but I came up here early this week to get some work done." Something about her story bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I helped her to her feet and guided her toward the door. "We need to get you out of here while I search the house." "Is there anyone else who should be here? Family members, employees, anyone like that?" "No," she said quickly. "It's just me. I live alone." We made it to the hallway, and I could see the staircase leading down to the main floor. Everything was quiet, but I had the feeling that someone was watching us from the shadows. I drew my weapon again and started down the stairs, keeping Jennifer behind me. "Stay close and stay quiet," I whispered. "We're going to go straight to my patrol car, and then I'll come back to search the house." But as we reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard something that made me freeze. It was the sound of my own radio, crackling to life from somewhere in the house. But that was impossible. My radio was clipped to my belt, and I could feel it there. Yet I could clearly hear dispatch calling my unit number, asking for a status update. "Unit 23, this is dispatch. Please respond with your status." I grabbed my radio and keyed the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I'm at the residence on Mockingbird Lane with the victim. Still searching for the intruder." But even as I spoke into my radio, I could hear another voice responding to dispatch from somewhere else in the house. It was my own voice, saying exactly the same words I was saying, but with a slight delay, like an echo. Jennifer heard it too. She grabbed my arm and looked at me with confusion and growing fear. "What is that? How is that possible?" I didn't have an answer for her. I'd never experienced anything like this before, and it was starting to freak me out. But I had a job to do, and there was still an intruder somewhere in the house. I guided Jennifer toward the front door, planning to get her to safety and then figure out what was going on with the radio. But when we reached the front door, it was closed and locked again. The wood around the lock was intact, showing no signs of the damage I'd caused when I kicked it in just minutes earlier. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if I'd never broken into the house at all. "That's impossible," I said, examining the door more closely. "I kicked this door in. The lock was broken." Jennifer was looking at me strangely now, like she was starting to doubt my competence or my sanity. "Are you sure? Maybe you came in through a different door?" But I knew what I'd done. I remembered the sound of the wood splintering, the way the door had swung open. I checked the other doors on the main floor, but they were all locked tight. The only way out seemed to be through the broken basement window I'd found earlier, but that would mean going down into the basement where the intruder might be hiding. I tried my radio again, but this time there was no response from dispatch. Just static, and occasionally that echo of my own voice from somewhere else in the house. It was like the building itself was playing back recordings of everything I said, but with a delay that made it sound haunting and unnatural. "Jennifer," I said, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight. From the beginning, don't leave anything out." She looked nervous now, wringing her hands and avoiding eye contact. "I told you, a man broke in through the basement. He tied me up and robbed the house." "What did he steal?" I don't know. I was tied up in the bedroom. I couldn't see what he was doing. But you said he robbed the house. How do you know he took anything if you couldn't see him?" Jennifer didn't have an answer for that. She just stared at me with those wide, frightened eyes, and I realized that something was very wrong with this whole situation. The story didn't add up, the physical evidence didn't match what I remembered doing, and now I was hearing impossible sounds from my own radio. I decided to check the basement, despite the risk. If there really was an intruder down there, I needed to find him. And if there wasn't, then I needed to figure out what was really going on in this house. I found a door that led to the basement stairs and opened it carefully, my weapon drawn and my flashlight ready. The basement was finished, with carpet on the floor and wood paneling on the walls. It looked like it had been set up as a recreation room, with a pool table and a big screen TV. But it was also obviously abandoned, with dust covers over the furniture and a musty smell that suggested it hadn't been used in months. I made my way carefully through the room, checking behind the pool table and in the corners where someone might be hiding. That's when I found the broken window I'd seen from outside. But instead of glass scattered on the floor, the area was clean. The window was intact, with no signs of damage. I examined it closely with my flashlight, but there were no cracks, no missing pieces, nothing to suggest it had ever been broken. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I knew what I'd seen outside. I remembered the broken glass glittering in my flashlight beam, the jagged edges around the window frame. But now there was no evidence that any of it had happened. I went back upstairs, my mind racing. Jennifer was still standing by the front door, and she looked at me expectantly as I emerged from the basement. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "No," I said, "nothing." "Jennifer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you sure you called 911 tonight?" She hesitated for just a moment too long. "Of course I called. That's how you got here, isn't it?" "When did you call?" "What time?" Around 2:30, I think, maybe 2:45. That matched what dispatch had told me, but something in her tone suggested she was making it up as she went along. I decided to test her. "What did you tell the dispatcher?" "I told them someone was breaking into my house through the basement." "And then what happened?" "The line went dead. I guess he cut the phone line or something." But I'd seen the house from outside before I entered. All the lights were on, which meant the electricity was working, and I hadn't seen any phone lines that had been cut. More importantly, if someone had cut the landline, she would have used her cell phone to call 911, and cell towers keep detailed records of all calls. I pulled out my own cell phone and tried to call dispatch, but I had no signal. No bars at all, which was strange because I'd had at least some coverage when I'd arrived. It was as if the house was somehow blocking all communication with the outside world. "Jennifer," I said, "I think we need to leave. Something isn't right here." But when I turned to look at her, she was gone. I spun around, searching the room, but she was nowhere to be seen. I called her name, but there was no response. I checked the other rooms on the main floor, then went back upstairs to the bedroom where I'd found her. It was empty, with no signs that anyone had ever been there. The rope and duct tape I'd cut away were gone, and the bed looked like it hadn't been slept in. I was alone in the house, and I was starting to panic. Nothing made sense anymore. I couldn't trust my own memory, couldn't trust what I was seeing, couldn't even trust my own equipment. I tried the front door again, but it was still locked. I went to the back door, but that was locked too. I was trapped inside with no way to communicate with the outside world. That's when I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere upstairs. But this time, I recognized the rhythm of the steps. They matched my own gait exactly, the way I walked when I was being careful and trying not to make noise. Someone was walking around upstairs, and they were walking exactly like me. I drew my weapon and headed for the stairs, but as I reached the bottom step, I heard my own voice calling out from above. "Police! Where are you? Call out to me!" It was exactly what I'd said when I'd first entered the house, but now someone else was saying it. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding. The voice came again, from the bedroom at the end of the hall. "Ma'am, this is Officer Morrison with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Are you injured? Can you unlock the door?" I reached the bedroom and found the door standing open. Inside, I could see myself kneeling beside the bed, cutting rope away from Jennifer's wrists. But I was also standing in the hallway watching myself. It was like looking at a movie of something that had happened earlier, except that the movie was happening in real time, right in front of me. The other version of me helped Jennifer to her feet and guided her toward the door. As they approached, I stepped aside to let them pass, but they walked right through me like I wasn't there. I could feel a cold sensation as they passed, like walking through a freezer, but they showed no awareness of my presence. I followed them downstairs and watched as the other me tried the front door and found it locked. I watched the confusion on my own face as I examined the door and realized it showed no signs of damage. I watched Jennifer look at me with growing suspicion and fear. And I listened as I asked her to tell me exactly what had happened, knowing that her story wouldn't add up. But this time, I noticed details I'd missed before. Jennifer's nightgown wasn't just clean and wrinkle-free, it was bone-dry, even though I could see now that she was sweating from fear. Her makeup wasn't just fresh, it was perfect, like she'd just stepped out of a salon. And her voice, when she spoke, had an artificial quality to it, like she was reading from a script. I followed the other me down to the basement and watched as I searched the recreation room. But this time, I could see things that I'd missed before. There were no footprints in the dust on the floor, no signs that anyone had been down here in months. And the window I'd thought was broken was obviously intact, with no damage whatsoever. When the other me came back upstairs, I watched the conversation with Jennifer about the 911 call. But this time, I could see the lies in her facial expressions, the way she paused before answering each question, the way she looked away when she was making something up. It was obvious that she'd never called 911. Obvious that her whole story was fabricated. And then I watched as the other me turned to look for Jennifer and found that she'd disappeared. I watched the confusion and panic on my own face as I searched the house and found no trace of her. I watched myself try the doors and find them locked, watched myself realize that I was trapped. But this time, I knew where Jennifer had gone. She was standing right next to me in the hallway, watching the scene play out just like I was. But when I turned to look at her, she wasn't Jennifer anymore. She was someone else entirely. Someone I recognized but couldn't quite place. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her voice completely different from the one she'd used when she was pretending to be a victim. "Understand what?" I asked, though I was starting to get a sick feeling in my stomach. "You're not the first officer to respond to this call," she said. "There have been others, dozens of others over the years. They all come here thinking they're responding to a break-in, thinking they're rescuing a victim. But there never was a break-in. There never was a victim." I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're not really here, Jake. You're not really responding to a call. You died 3 hours ago in a car accident on Highway 74, about 10 miles from here. You've been dead since 11:30 p.m. The words hit me like a physical blow. I tried to deny it, tried to remember driving to the house, but suddenly I couldn't. The memory was gone, replaced by something else. I remembered driving down Highway 74 in the rain, remembered seeing headlights coming toward me in my lane, remembered yanking the steering wheel to the right and feeling my patrol car leave the road. "No," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "That's not possible. I'm here. I'm talking to you." "You're here because you can't accept that you're dead," she said gently. "You keep replaying this scenario over and over, trying to save someone, trying to prove that you're still a good cop. But there's no one to save, Jake. There never was." I looked at the other version of myself, still searching the house for a victim who didn't exist. I watched him try the doors again and again, trapped in a loop that would never end. And I realized that's what I'd been doing for hours, maybe days. Replaying the same scene, making the same discoveries, having the same conversations. "How long have I been here?" I asked. "Time doesn't work the same way when you're dead," she said. "But in the real world, it's been 3 days since your accident. They're planning your funeral for tomorrow." I felt a crushing weight of sadness and regret. Linda would be at the funeral, probably crying for the marriage we'd lost as much as for my death. My partner would give a speech about what a good cop I'd been, even though I'd been struggling with depression and alcoholism for months. My parents would wonder where they'd gone wrong, how their son had ended up dead at 32 with nothing to show for his life but a failed marriage and a job that had slowly eaten away at his soul. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you," she said. "You can keep replaying this scene forever, or you can let go. You can accept what happened and move on." "Move on to what?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Nobody knows what comes next, but it has to be better than this, than being trapped in the same nightmare over and over again." I looked at the other version of myself one more time. He was trying his radio again, getting only static and the echo of his own voice. He would keep trying, keep searching, keep believing that he could save someone if he just tried hard enough. But there was no one to save, and there never had been. "Okay," I said, "I'm ready to let go." The woman smiled, and suddenly I could see who she really was. She was Officer Maria Santos, who died in a motorcycle accident 5 years earlier. I'd known her at the academy, had worked with her a few times before she transferred to a different district. She'd always been kind, always been the one to help rookies who were struggling with the job. "It's time to go, Jake," she said, taking my hand. The house began to fade around us, becoming insubstantial like smoke. The other version of myself faded too, still trapped in his endless loop, but no longer my concern. I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, a burden I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. "Will I see them again?" I asked. "Linda, my parents, my friends." "Eventually," Maria said, "but not yet. They have their own lives to live, their own time to serve. You can't help them anymore, Jake. You can only help yourself." We walked together through the fading remnants of the house, through walls that were no longer solid, through a world that was no longer real. And as we walked, I felt the guilt and regret and sadness of my life beginning to fall away, piece by piece, like old clothes that no longer fit. Behind us, I could hear the other Jake still searching, still calling out for a victim who would never answer. But that wasn't my problem anymore. That wasn't my burden to carry. I was done being a cop, done trying to save people who didn't need saving, done trying to be something I'd never really been. I was ready for whatever came next, whatever lay beyond the endless repetition of failure and disappointment that my life had become. I was ready to be free. The last thing I heard as we walked away was the sound of my radio, crackling with static and echoing voices from a world I was finally leaving behind. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. But even as we walked through that fading landscape, even as I felt the weight of my earthly burdens lifting away, I couldn't help but think about the other Jake still trapped in that house. He would keep searching, keep trying to save Jennifer, keep believing that if he just worked harder, tried longer, stayed more dedicated, he could make everything right. It was the curse of being a cop, I realized. We're trained to never give up, to always keep fighting, even when the fight is already lost. "What about him?" I asked Maria, looking back at the house that was now just a shimmer in the distance. "What about the version of me that's still in there?" Maria's expression grew sad. "He'll keep going until he learns what you just learned. Some spirits figure it out quickly. Others take years, decades even. There was one officer who got stuck in a loop for almost 50 years before he finally accepted what had happened to him." 50 years? The thought horrified me. How is that possible? "Time isn't linear where we're going," she explained. "A day can feel like a year, or a year can pass in what feels like minutes. It all depends on how tightly you're holding onto the world you left behind." We walked in silence for a while through what seemed like a vast gray space. neither light nor dark, neither warm nor cold. It was like being in a waiting room between worlds, a place where the rules of physics and reality didn't quite apply. I found myself thinking about my life, about all the things I'd done wrong and all the opportunities I'd missed. "Do you regret it?" I asked Maria. "Dying, I mean." She considered the question for a long time before answering. "I regret the things I didn't do more than the things I did. I regret not telling my partner how I felt about him. I regret not calling my mother more often. I regret spending so much time worried about my career that I forgot to actually live my life." I thought about Linda, about the fights we'd had in those last months before she filed for divorce. Most of them had been about my drinking, about the way I'd shut her out when I came home from particularly bad shifts. She'd tried to get me to talk to someone, to get help, but I'd been too proud, too stubborn. I'd convinced myself that I could handle it on my own, that real cops didn't need therapy. "I should have listened to her," I said. Linda, my wife. She knew I was struggling and she tried to help, but I pushed her away. "That's the thing about being alive," Maria said. "You always think you have more time. You always think you can fix things tomorrow, next week, next year. But time runs out faster than you expect." As we continued walking, I began to notice other figures in the gray space around us. Some were walking purposefully, like they knew where they were going. Others were wandering aimlessly, looking lost and confused, and some were just standing still, staring back in the direction they'd come from, apparently unable or unwilling to move forward. "Who are they?" I asked. "Other people making the transition," Maria said. "Some died peacefully, surrounded by family. Those are the ones who move through quickly. Others died suddenly, violently, or alone. They have a harder time letting go." I saw a woman in a hospital gown, probably in her 70s, walking with purpose toward something I couldn't see. She looked serene, at peace with whatever was happening to her. But nearby, I saw a young man in military fatigues, maybe 25 years old, sitting on what appeared to be a concrete barrier. He was staring back the way we'd come, and his face was filled with anguish. "He's been there for 6 months," Maria said, noticing my gaze. "Died in Afghanistan, left behind a pregnant wife. He can't accept that he'll never see his child born, never hold his son." "His son?" "The baby was born 3 months ago. Healthy boy, looks just like his father. But the soldier doesn't know that, and even if someone told him, I don't think it would help. He's convinced that his family needs him, that he has to find a way back to them." I thought about my own family, about the funeral that was happening tomorrow. Would my parents blame themselves for my death? Would Linda feel guilty about the divorce? Wonder if things might have been different if she'd tried harder to save our marriage? The thought of them carrying that burden, that unnecessary guilt, made me want to turn around and go back. But Maria seemed to sense what I was thinking. "You can't help them by staying," she said firmly. "You can only hurt them by refusing to let go. The living need to grieve, to heal, to move on with their lives. They can't do that if they sense that you're still hanging around, still trying to be part of their world." "How do you know all this?" "Because I spent 2 years trying to go back," she admitted. 2 years haunting my old precinct, trying to help my partner solve cases, trying to communicate with him. All I accomplished was making him think he was losing his mind. He started drinking, started making mistakes on the job, nearly got himself killed because he was so distracted by what he thought were messages from me. What happened to him? He eventually got help, therapy, medication, the works. He's a good cop now, better than he was when I was alive, but it took him years to get there, years of struggling with guilt and grief that I made worse by not letting go. We passed another group of spirits, these ones dressed in what looked like period clothing from different eras. A man in a Civil War uniform was talking to a woman in a 1950s dress, comparing their experiences of death and transition. It was surreal, like walking through a museum where all the exhibits were alive and interactive. "How long have you been here?" I asked Maria. "5 years in your time, but it feels like both forever and no time at all," she said. "I help new arrivals make the transition. It's my job now, I guess, my penance for the time I spent trying to cling to my old life. Is that what I'll do? Help other cops who die? Maybe, or maybe you'll do something completely different. I don't think anyone knows for sure until they get there." "Where exactly is there?" Maria smiled. "You'll know when you see it." We walked for what felt like hours, though I had no real sense of time passing. The gray space began to change gradually, becoming less uniform, more varied. I started to see colors in the distance, soft and muted at first, then gradually brighter and more distinct. There were shapes, too, architectural forms that suggested buildings or structures, though nothing that looked quite like anything from the world I'd left behind. "Maria," I said, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you died in that motorcycle accident, what was the last thing you thought about?" She was quiet for a long time, and I wondered if I'd asked something too painful, but eventually she spoke. "I was thinking about a case I'd been working on. A missing child, 8 years old, disappeared from her front yard while her mother was inside making lunch. We'd been searching for 3 weeks with no leads, no witnesses, nothing. I was on my way to interview a potential witness when the drunk driver hit me. Did they ever find her? Yes, but not until 2 years later. She'd been taken by a family friend, someone nobody suspected. She was found alive and returned to her family. But for 2 years, I was convinced that my death had somehow caused her to remain missing, that if I'd just lived long enough to conduct that interview, I could have solved the case and brought her home. But that wasn't true. No, it wasn't. The interview I was going to wouldn't have led anywhere. The person I was going to see didn't know anything useful. But I spent 2 years believing that my death had somehow failed that little girl, and that belief kept me trapped between worlds. I thought about my own unfinished cases, the investigations I'd been working on when I died. There was a string of convenience store robberies that I'd been tracking, a domestic violence case where I was worried the husband might escalate to murder, a missing person report that had just come in the day before my accident. Would those cases go unsolved because I wasn't there to work them? Would people suffer because I'd failed them by dying? "You're doing it right now," Maria said, apparently reading my thoughts. "You're creating chains that will bind you to the old world. You have to let go of the idea that you're indispensable, that the world can't function without you." But what if I could have made a difference? What if my death means that someone else dies who didn't have to? And what if your obsession with that possibility means you never move on? What if you spend the next 50 years trapped in loops like the one you just escaped, replaying scenarios over and over, trying to save people who don't need saving? She had a point, but it was hard to accept. My whole identity had been built around being a protector, a solver of problems, a person who stood between chaos and order. How do you let go of something that fundamental to who you are? "It's the hardest part for cops," Maria said, as if reading my mind again. "We're trained to take responsibility for everything, to believe that we can control outcomes through sheer force of will. But death is the ultimate loss of control, and learning to accept that is part of the transition." As we continued walking, the colors in the distance became clearer and more defined. I could see what looked like a city, but unlike any city I'd ever seen before. The buildings seemed to be made of light itself, shifting and flowing like liquid while maintaining their structural integrity. There were people moving between the buildings, but they moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were no longer bound by the physical limitations of human bodies. "Is that where we're going?" I asked. "That's one of the places you could go," Maria said. "There are many options, many different paths. Some people choose to rest for a while, to process their earthly experiences before moving on to new challenges. Others choose to immediately begin new forms of existence, new types of learning and growth. What did you choose?" "I chose to help others make the transition, at least for now." It felt like a natural extension of the work I did as a police officer, just on a different scale. We were getting closer to the City of Light, and I could see that it was even more magnificent than it had appeared from a distance. The buildings seemed to pulse with their own internal energy, and I could hear what sounded like music, though it was unlike any music I'd ever heard before. It was as if the city itself was singing, harmonizing with the movements and activities of its inhabitants. But even as I marveled at the beauty of what lay ahead, I found myself looking back one more time toward the gray space we'd left behind. Somewhere back there, the other Jake was still trapped in that house, still searching for Jennifer, still trying to solve a case that had no solution. And beyond that, in the world of the living, Linda was probably picking out clothes for my funeral. My parents were probably struggling to understand how their son had died so young. And my fellow officers were probably trying to figure out how to carry on without me. "The hardest part," Maria said gently, "is accepting that they'll be okay without you. That they'll grieve for a while, but then they'll heal and move on and build new lives that don't include you. It feels like a betrayal, like you're abandoning them. But it's actually the greatest gift you can give them. How is abandoning them a gift? Because holding on to them, trying to remain part of their world, keeps them trapped in their grief. It prevents them from healing, from growing, from becoming the people they're meant to become after you're gone. Love isn't possession, Jake. Real love is letting go when it's time to let go." As we approached the city, I began to feel a strange sensation, like I was becoming lighter, less solid. It wasn't frightening exactly, but it was profoundly different from anything I'd ever experienced. It was as if the very atoms of my being were loosening their bonds, preparing to transform into something new. "What's happening to me?" I asked. "You're beginning the final transition," Maria said. "Your earthly form is dissolving, and you're becoming something new. It's natural, part of the process. Will I still be me? You'll be the best version of yourself, the version that was always there but was hidden by fear and pain and limitation. You'll still have your memories, your experiences, your essential nature, but you'll be free of all the things that held you back when you were alive." I thought about the person I'd been in life, the anger and frustration and disappointment that had defined so much of my existence. The failed marriage, the drinking problem, the depression that I'd tried so hard to hide from everyone around me. Would all of that really just fall away, leaving behind some purified version of myself? What about my mistakes? I asked. What about all the things I did wrong? They're part of your story, part of what brought you to this point, Maria said. But they don't define you anymore. They're just experiences you had, lessons you learned, stepping stones on the path to who you're becoming. We reached the edge of the city, and I could see that there were others waiting there to greet new arrivals. Some I recognized as people who had died during my lifetime, faces I'd seen in obituaries or news reports. Others were completely unfamiliar, but they all radiated the same sense of peace and completion that I was beginning to feel myself. An older man approached us, wearing what looked like a police uniform, but one that seemed to be made of the same light as the buildings around us. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile, and something about him seemed familiar, though I was sure I'd never met him before. "Officer Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome. I'm Captain William Hayes, retired from this life in 1987. I've been looking forward to meeting you." I shook his hand, surprised by how solid it felt despite its apparent composition of light. "How do you know me?" "I know all the officers who make the transition," he said. "It's part of my work here. I help them understand what comes next, help them choose their path forward." "Their path?" "There are many possibilities," Captain Hayes explained. "Some choose to rest and reflect on their earthly experiences. Some choose to reincarnate, to return to physical existence with new challenges and opportunities. Some choose to become guides for others who are making the transition. And some choose to explore entirely new forms of existence that have no parallel in the physical world." I looked around at the city, at the beings of light moving through it with such purpose and grace. "What did you choose?" "I chose to serve," he said. "It's what I always did best in life, so it felt natural to continue in death. But my service here is different, broader, more meaningful than anything I could do when I was bound by physical limitations." Maria squeezed my hand. "This is where I leave you," she said. "Captain Hayes will take good care of you from here." "Will I see you again?" "Of course. Time and space work differently here. We're all connected, all part of the same larger existence. When you're ready, when you want to see me again, you'll be able to." She gave me a hug, and I felt a warmth and peace that I'd never experienced in life. It was like being embraced by unconditional love itself, like coming home after a long and difficult journey. "Thank you," I said, "for everything, for helping me understand, for showing me the way." "You would have found it eventually," she said. "You're stronger than you think, Jake. You always were." She walked away, back toward the gray space where other lost souls were probably struggling with their own transitions. I watched her go with a mixture of sadness and gratitude, knowing that she was returning to help others the way she'd helped me. Captain Hayes put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Ready to see what comes next?" he asked. I took one last look back toward the world I'd left behind, toward the darkness where the other Jake was still trapped in his endless loop of failure and frustration. I sent him a silent message of encouragement, a hope that he would eventually find the strength to let go as I had. And then I turned toward the city of light, toward whatever new existence awaited me there. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. Together we walked into the city, and I felt the last of my earthly weight fall away. I was no longer Officer Jake Morrison of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I was something new, something better, something free. And for the first time since I could remember, I was truly at peace. The city welcomed me with its song of light and harmony, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever new challenges and opportunities awaited me, I would face them with the wisdom I'd gained from both my life and my death. I was ready to serve again in whatever capacity this new existence required. I was ready to be more than I'd ever been able to be when I was alive. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the city's celestial music, I could still hear the echo of that radio static calling out across the void between worlds. But it no longer held any power over me. It was just a memory now, a reminder of what I'd left behind and how far